Sharon Hecker and Julia Peyton-Jones, who are sitting here in front. It's come about quite speedily, as indeed did the exhibition, and I think in about 3 months, which makes this gathering all the more impressive. Two things are commonly said about Rosso. One, that he's an artist's artist. That's often code for underregarded by the wider public. Another is, and this is to borrow a phrase that Sharon Hecker has written in her text, also borrowed, I believe, from Hilton Kramer, that it's the prerogative of the person who speaks first to borrow other people's lines, that Rosso is an artist whose work and reputation has always remained unstable, that it regularly goes into eclipse. Whether that's true now as it was when written in 1961, I don't know. The reasons for this may be debated. But on both counts, it seems to me today that here, at least, Rosso's sun is rising. Testimony to this is the size and variety of this audience, here in this small room, but also beyond. As you're aware, this event is being live streamed, courtesy of Art Newspaper. We're very grateful to Art Newspaper and Anna Summers-Cox for this. And we're also very, and second testament is the diverse contributions to the day's sessions, which suggest multiple points of entry and interest into the artist and his work. And this is confirmed by the range and the quality of the participants. We thank them all for agreeing to take part. We'll meet them and name them as they come to speak. But I do want to signal the healthy and distinctive nature of an event that brings together artists and art historians and experts of such high caliber, together with enthusiasts and novices, those newly interested. I'm of the latter two categories, so I look forward to hearing and learning, and I'll return in the final session as such, enthusiast and novice, together with my colleague Sasha Gerstin, who's anything but. She's an enthusiast, but she's anything but a novice, and we will be talking with the co-curators of the exhibition, asking them to hear more about the genesis and development of the exhibition and to discuss the many curatorial issues that the exhibition throws up, some of which no doubt will be prefigured in the conversations which will take part before then. But we're here now to talk about Rosso, so I'd like to hand over to Julia Peyton-Jones, the instigator of the event and the prime mover, to introduce the agenda and explain how the afternoon is going to go. Julia.
Well, I'm much encouraged by the day because it started extremely well with the collapse of the microphone, so it can only get better. As Martin said, I'm Julia Peyton-Jones. I was appointed Senior Global Director, Special Projects at Galerie Thaddaeus Ropac in September last year, following 25 years as Director of the Serpentine Gallery. My first project at the Ropac Gallery was to co-curate with Dr. Sharon Hecker, Medardo Rosso's Sight Unseen and his encounters with London. Together with Sharon, I would like to express our heartfelt thanks to the following people. Medardo Rosso's great-great-granddaughter, Danila Mazur, and her daughter, Gwendolina Gianni Mocchi, of the Museo Medardo Rosso, without whom the exhibition would not have been possible, and we're very honoured that you're here with us today. Thank you so much for coming. The lenders to the exhibition, of course, to Martin Cager-Smith and Fern Inch, together with their colleagues at the Courtauld Institute, the speakers participating in the study day, distinguished colleagues, and the artists through whose eyes we are likely to learn something truly new about their brother, Medardo Rosso. Anna Summers-Cox and our partners at the Art Newspaper, who are collaborating with the Courtauld and Galerie Thaddaeus Ropac on the live streaming of this event. Thaddaeus Ropac, Polly Robinson-Greer, and the Galerie Thaddaeus Ropac team. Before I started working at the gallery in September last year, Thaddaeus Ropac asked me 3 times if I thought it would be possible to organise a Medardo Rosso exhibition to open in November, and each time I said yes. It was a leap of faith on both our parts until Sharon agreed to be the co-curator. As one of the world's leading experts on Rosso's work and the curator of the very distinguished and successful Rosso exhibition at the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis, she knew almost better than anyone what is required to organise a Rosso exhibition of distinction. We began, firstly, and all importantly, with a visit to see Danila Mazur, the Museo Medardo Rosso, and then we approached a major collector of Rosso's works. And once we had secured both their support of the exhibition, I knew we had a show. Then the challenge began to make an exhibition of Rosso's work which was relevant to the context of the Ropac Gallery, a commercial gallery principally focused on contemporary art in Salzburg, Paris and London, with a roster of over 60 artists represented in global collections and exhibiting in museums and galleries worldwide. Sharon and I explored what could make our context fitting for Rosso's work. Our epiphany was his 1906 show at the Eugene Crometti Gallery at 44 Dover Street, a few doors away from 37 Dover Street, the Ropac Gallery address. In addition, Rosso's encounters with London, both in terms of the time he spent in the city and the work he did while he was here, had not been fully examined, and we took the key decision to look at Rosso's work through the lens of contemporary artists, and, in particular, the sculptor Tony Cragg, who was interviewed by me in the catalogue and had written about Rosso's work on a number of occasions. Having secured important works for the exhibition, the challenge was to identify additional sculpture so that we could display a range of subject matter and media, from 1883, arguably the date of his first mature work, up until 1906, the last time he had made an original subject. While we worked on the show, our research identified a number of photographs and drawings that related to London and had never been exhibited in the UK. We understood the degree to which Rosso used photography as a sketchbook, playing with scales, surface, and intensity, making profoundly different readings of the same subject matter, as well as the way his use of line was in synergy with the marks he used in his sculpture. Persuading lenders to part with their work was a challenge, as it always is, and how best to install it initiated endless discussion between Sharon and myself, a dialogue that benefited enormously from the involvement of Annabel Seldorf and her colleagues, who were commissioned to transform Ely House into the outstanding gallery that it is today. The creation of museum conditions and the challenge of a very tight timeline focused our minds, together with the omnipresent brief that we set ourselves, to create a context that would underscore the relevance of showing Rosso at Galerie Thaddaeus Ropac, and to make the historical contemporary, and to bring a contemporary view to the historical. So why a study day? Rosso still seems to be a closely guarded secret, and I'm fascinated about how and why people do or don't relate to his work. Rosso unveils the inner life of his subjects and touches on something which is vulnerable and immediate without being sentimental. To stand in front of his work and really look requires an empathy and an understanding of the human condition, which is somehow uncomfortable. The scale is modest and the experience intense. The context of the Ropac Gallery and the Ely Room, the oldest room in the building, provides an intimacy in keeping with Rosso and a freedom from museum restrictions. The sense of engagement with what you see is more instantaneous, and the juxtaposition of works much closer and more exposed than a museum might allow. When it came to the installation, the challenge was on the one hand to create a direct sense of engagement with the viewer, and on the other to create space for the work to be seen. The epiphany was to ask Museo Medardo Rosso to generously lend to the exhibition the plinths on which their work by Rosso are installed. The idea was a game changer and a counterintuitive response to Sharon's and my desire to make Rosso relate to a contemporary context. The plinths provided a synergy with the period pictures of Rosso in his studio on the one hand, and a level of authenticity on the other. Furthermore, they served to make this exhibition distinctive from the many other displays of his work. So why a study day? It is an opportunity to hear great minds talk about Rosso, an artist with a unique sensibility, to debate some of the characteristics that make a great work of art, and to understand better the qualities that create art, and what better way to do this than with a stellar group of academics and artists. If you have any comments or wish to participate in today's discussion, please tag at Thaddaeus Ropac, at Art Newspaper, at Courtauld Institute for Art, Courtauld Institute of Art. And if you decide not to comment during the study day, but would prefer to do so more informally, please join us for a private viewing of the Rosso exhibition, as well as the launch of the book, which accompanies the show from 6:30 today at Galerie Thaddaeus Ropac. And now for the first session of the day. Rosso, Anti-Monumentality and Experiment, moderated by Dr. Sharon Hecker, co-curator of the exhibition. Sharon specializes in modern and contemporary Italian art. A leading expert on Rosso, she has authored over 30 publications on the artist, including A Moment's Monument, Medardo Rosso, and the International Origins of Modern Sculpture, awarded the Millard Meese Publication Fund, and recently published in Italian. She has also curated numerous exhibitions on Rosso, including Medardo Rosso Second Impressions, Harvard University Art Museums, and the retrospective Medardo Rosso Experiments in Light and Form, Pulitzer Arts Foundation. For her work on Rosso, Sharon has received awards from the Getty, Fulbright, and Mellon Foundations. She also writes about key 20th century Italian artists such as Lucio Fontana and Lucio Fabbro, and is the co-author of Post-War Italian Art History Today, Untying the Knot. Sharon, please come.
Thank you, Julia, and I too would like to reiterate great thanks to Thaddaeus Ropac, his wonderful team, to my amazing partner in crime, Julia Payton-Jones, to Martin for organizing this, to Daniela Marsure and Gwendolina for helping us to make this possible, and all the great minds and souls that are here today. Whoops, there we go. Medardo Rosso is among the most innovative, important figures in the history of modern sculpture. In his time, he was hailed as both the founder of Impressionist sculpture and the forefather of Futurism. Rodin, Boccioni, Brancusi, Giacometti, and Moore all admired his revolutionary ideas, and he continues to inspire artists today. Rosso aimed to modernize the medium of sculpture. He defied the heroic, idealized depictions typical of the medium. Rejecting sculpture's isolated, hierarchical status, he instead made anti-heroic heads and figure groups that captured fleeting impressions drawn from La Vie Moderne. Through depictions of everyday subjects, mothers, women, children, the sick, and the elderly, he strove to dematerialize the sculptural object, rendering it susceptible to subtle interactions with light and surrounding atmosphere. His subjects appear caught in intense yet fugitive visual, physical, or emotional states. Rosso was born in Italy, but he shunned the idea of nationalism. When asked about his origins, he would say he was born on a train. His father worked for the Italian railway, but this tale of origin expressed the sculptor's sense of cosmopolitanism. He moved to Paris in 1889, where he lived for several decades and became a French citizen before returning to Italy after World War I. A radically experimental artist, Rosso subverted traditional modeling and casting methods to animate the surfaces of his sculptures. He made fewer than 50 original subjects that he frequently recast in plaster, bronze, and wax, his signature medium, eliciting different surface effects. Through his experiments with casting, he began using wax in unorthodox ways. Rather than hand modeling it over metal armatures, he cast melted wax into gelatin molds. Wax lent Rosso's fragile figures an uncanny association with human flesh. At the same time, his choices of this material, which when cast captured the marks of his fingers that formed the clay model, resonated with the word impression and became associated with Impressionism. The fluid, dreamy quality of his waxes also aligned his sculptures with symbolism. When making bronzes, the custom of the time was for sculptors to have their models professionally cast with smooth finishes and to remove imperfections that occurred during the process. Rosso cast many of his own works himself, retaining what was considered at the time unacceptable flaws and artifacts of casting: air bubbles, gashes, rips in the mold, screw holes, nails, channels, and sprues in the bronzes, and in his waxes, gobs of gelatin that adhered to the wax from its mother mold. Rosso further intervened by chasing away parts of the plaster investment left over from the casting process. He added blobs of plaster to the backs and bottoms of his finished objects, shifting their inclinations and making them appear unstable, an effect enhanced by his unusual bases. He also had casting parties in which he invited guests to watch him cast bronzes. Audiences found these performances so unusual and exciting that many recorded the experience in reviews, diaries, and even a novel. And here's just an image of the backs of Rosso's works, although he didn't want people to see the backs. We can talk about that later. Rosso also made private experiments in other media. I've been showing you mostly his own photographs of his sculptures under various lighting conditions, developed in different sizes, cropped and reprinted on myriad paper textures. He made drawings of figures in motion, of city squares and landscapes, sketched on jagged, cut, or folded scraps of paper, envelopes, hotel stationery, and on the backs of business cards from restaurants, then photographed and rephotographed. His play with the marks, textures, and lighting effects make his images seem to be emerging from and disappearing into their surroundings. Rosso began his career in Milan in 1881 with no formal artistic training. His early works were realistic in style. He was expelled from art school for misconduct after only 11 months. By 1883, he was sculpting modern urban subjects whose broken up, painterly surfaces became permeable to transient effects of light, shadow, and atmosphere. Eta Sauria is said to represent Rosso's wife embracing their newborn child, whom Rosso christened Francesca Hurrah Rebel, in an allusion to his own rebellious nature. Here, Rosso reconfigured traditional sculptural relief. Mother and child barely emerge from an unformed mass. He also discovered a sculptural language with which to represent a psychological living moment. By making the emotional situation contingent, ambiguous, and suggestive, he transmitted a vivid paradox, a deep affective relationship that seems to occur in a fugitive instant. In 1889, Rosso abandoned his wife and child and moved to Paris, where he participated in a few exhibitions, set up a studio, and began casting in wax in addition to bronze and plaster. In Enfant en Scène, the work you see here, he dramatically removed the mother's head, retaining only her body and foregrounding the head of the child. He also shifted the works to various angles. Some casts are frontal, while others lie on one side, so that the child appears to come up from below or hover above. While others, deliteralizing the mother, Rosso visualized the maternal as an amorphous mass of sculptural matter. In Après la Visite, we glimpse, as if through a scrim, a sick man in the hospital slumped over in a private moment of exhaustion after the visit and the public performance have ended. The impression is of a present sensation fused with a foggy, distant memory. Enfant Soleil references his interest in the effects of sunlight shining on the barely modeled face of a child. Bambino Ebreo hovers between a real portrait and an imaginary one. Heavy, shadowy indentations suggest the boy's downcast eyes, contributing to his mood of brooding. Rosso, who used this work as a calling card, may have identified with the stereotype of the wandering Jew, as embodied in rootlessness and a perennial feeling of being the outsider. Rosso's presentational gestures are also noteworthy. He constantly shifted the dates and titles of his works, keeping time moving and fluid. He devised innovative exhibition strategies of placing his sculptures and photos in front of and in between the photographic reproductions of Rodin's work and in rooms dedicated to paintings by other artists, such as Cézanne and Renoir. At the time, these gestures were considered outlandish acts of infiltration into other artists' galleries. He also exhibited photographs of his own drawings and signed copies he made of other artists' works from earlier epochs, as you can see there. He used exhibition catalogs to publish his photographs of his sculptures and drawings. Although all these things are common nowadays, these tactics were revolutionary for their time. Rosso's masterpiece was a portrait of Alfred William Monde, later titled Échepuer. The enigmatic, larger-than-lifetime head appears barely glimpsed, like an impression being recalled from memory. According to family legend, Rosso saw Alfred behind a parted curtain, while others say that he saw him at the first rays of morning light. Alfred would later commit suicide. While Rosso could not have known of Alfred's impending tragic end, his sculpture carries with it a trace of the boy's emotional and physical vulnerability. A critic dubbed it a moment's monument. After his death, Rosso was largely forgotten. This is partly explained by his refusal to provide the solid, heroic, nationally defined vision of sculpture for which the public yearned. His anti-heroic subjects with their small size, often fragile materials, and fragmented states, conflicted with public expectations about what sculpture should be. Now, because Rosso's work is contrary to the monumental genre, his 7 monument projects, perhaps better described as anti-monuments, remain little known. So I thought I'd introduce you to them very briefly because they're a lesser known part of his project. For some, I don't have images because they were just projects. Rosso made 2 revolutionary monument proposals from one of Italy's founding fathers, Giuseppe Garibaldi. The traditional way in which sculptors established their reputations was to monuments to national heroes. Garibaldi's death provided Rosso with his first chance. The creation of a heroic image of Garibaldi was considered vital to the mourning process and to bolster myths of national strength at a fragile historical moment. But Rosso was part of a generation of disillusioned men who had not fought to unify Italy and could not identify with his heroic ideals. So these are some of the typical monuments to Garibaldi that you would find in Italy. Instead of portraying a virile Garibaldi standing or on horseback, Rosso depicted him as a mature thinker, sitting on a rock by the sea with a classical winged genius flying over his head, titling his project The Genius of Humanity. While the commissioners recognized Rosso's as the most innovative proposal, they rejected the work because, I quote, "the person of the general seems gloomy, glaring, and oppressed." Rosso's less stereotypical Garibaldi might have been intended to recognize those who, like himself, saw the current political situation in a non-heroic light, outside the moments of action and battle. Instead, he emphasized Garibaldi's wisdom and calm, as well as his love of the sea, his willful exile to the island of Caprera. Rosso's second monument to Garibaldi, titled Gratitude, Excitement, Promise, is described as, quote, "a group of demonstrators that come to blow with the public security guards and with the police. A flag bearer climbs up the post and waves a banner. All around are people who squabble and roll around on the ground." In an extreme gesture of protest, Rosso eliminated the figure of Garibaldi from the very monument that was intended to glorify him. This proposal was also rejected. The modernity of Rosso's monument lies in its refusal of the tradition of heroic myth-making and sculpture. His image suggested division rather than unity, and imagined clash between demonstrators and guards. It doesn't seem to relate to any historic event whose meaning could be shared by all. Whatever the conflict was about, it was neither contained nor resolved by the reassuring, lofty presence of an icon or a hero. Rosso's first funerary commission, La Riconoscenza, is another radical anti-monument. It shows a female figure lying prostrate on her stomach over an open tomb. Rosso rejected what he saw as meaningless religious and social conventions of mourning, here are typical ones, in typical funerary monuments, the restrained and modestly dressed female member or allegory of sorrow or mourning, head bowed in prayer or raised upwards to heaven. Rosso depicted his mourner, this is the final version, as a generic working class woman, dressed realistically in a costume that reveals her legs, barefoot with her sandals cast to one side. Her head is uncovered and her hair is unkempt. The sandals presented evidence of an earlier act, her removal of the shoes. Rosso thus makes the scene appear to unfold horizontally in space and time as if it were a painting, rather than freezing into an internal, pregnant moment like a sculpture. The woman seems to embrace the grave so as to establish direct communication with the dead. Rosso shows no reassuring resolution or closure. Death becomes a void. This is very unchristian for the cemetery. Possibly inspired by Courbet's very daring empty grave in the Burial of Ornans by Courbet, Rosso instead created an intimate, emotionally charged image of mourning and loss. Startlingly, Rosso abolished the pedestal, setting the work directly on the ground, erasing sculpture's traditional hierarchical, elevated vertical position. La Riconoscenza is the first sculptural example of the fusion between a sculpture and its base. And if you think that it prefigures, by several years, Degas' Le Tube, a floor sculpture showing a woman bathing in a steel basin intended to be filled with real water. Predictably, Rosso's work was read as transgressive and removed from the cemetery. The woman was described as lacking propriety and modesty, quote, covered with scanty clothing and shaggy body hair like Mother Eve after the sin. Two further funerary works by Rosso show his disregard for conventions of harmony and proportion associated with traditional monuments. One was to Vincenzo Brusco Onis, a cultural and political activist. The tomb is a roughly sculpted, yet completely flattened and relief-like representation of a large head and part of a bust in a three-quarter pose, all cast in bronze. The oddly thin and flattened bronze pedestal cannot support the wider torso, reversing traditional proportions and relationships between sculpture and base. Since the work could not stand up on its own, Rosso attached it to the cemetery wall on a cement plaque. And here's that wonderful detail of the two sprues left in the urn, which were left over from casting. Rosso's final funerary tribute to music critic Filippo Filippi presents a roughly sculpted and completely jumbled cast of elements. He crudely breaks up the surface of the front and sides, covering it with the marks of his hands and fist, while leaving the back unsculpted. A distorted head is turned to a three-quarters stance and truncated below the shoulders. You can see that here. An elongated pedestal is neither harmoniously joined with nor in proportion to the head it supports, or the enormous horizontal stone base on which the monument rests. The entire work is covered with strange fragments and disproportionate decorations. I don't know if you can see this. A large nude woman, you can see her arm, with a child in her arm on one side of the pedestal in an ornamental cascade that also features a minuscule puto and a mandolin at the bottom. At the foot of the pedestal is an illegible musical score scratched onto a roughly cut sheet of bronze. Fragments of text all over the monument, each modeled in different fonts, ranged from the raised, boxy capital letters of the enormous word perché, meaning why or because, attached to the horizontal base, to the thin, drippy upper and lowercase letters of Filippi's name sliding down the pedestal. Nobody could figure out how to read this monument. It was not a comforting image of death or mourning. I will close with two uncommissioned revolutionary anti-monuments. The first was Impression d'Omnibus. In 5 busts, Rosso depicts local types on a modern mode of transportation. The busts are placed side by side on a table, attached together with lumps of material. Only the name of the work allows the viewer to imagine these as figures riding on an omnibus. For this work, Rosso reconfigured a lithograph by Daumier. You can see it's a mirror image, placing himself, as you can see him, in the exact position in a mirror image of the conductor in Daumier's print. Rosso abolishes all of Daumier's carefully described interactions. Each figure appears to be absorbed in private thought. Daumier's overlapping bodies, with which the caricaturist creates a humorous sense of social tension and unease, do not touch one another in Rosso's work. Their separateness is reinforced even as they are fused into one object. The work resonates with Rodin's Le Bourgeois de Calais of the same period, but Rodin's monument is historical, while Rosso's is a picture of the urban modern experience. Both adopt modern unheroic existential language and break up the traditional forms of the monument, but Rosso's is more experimental, a modern tableau with neither narrative nor interpretation. Rosso and Rodin dismantle the traditional base in different ways. Rosso's unprecedentedly low work unprecedentedly low work allows the viewer to enter it, while Rosso eliminates the base altogether so that the figures themselves form the base. Rosso's faces wear the typical modern masks of blank introspection and alienation. No psychological insight is possible. Rosso's work was destroyed in transit to an exhibition, but continued to circulate through photographs. His unheroic sculpture anticipates works such as George Siegel's Bus Riders. Rosso's final monumental work was Impression du Boulevard Paris la Nuit, known only through his idiosyncratic studio photos of it. A roughly sculpted plaster model depicts 3 ambiguously defined, forward-leaning figures rendered in larger-than-life size, described by the title as crossing a Parisian boulevard at night. Rosso's work challenges all the conventions for a monument, uncommissioned, conceived for no specific site, nor to commemorate any important personality or historical event. It was made in France by a foreigner, and it was never exhibited. The plaster was never cast into bronze, and there was no effort to preserve it for eternity. Rosso drew on a painterly subject of people walking on Parisian boulevards. His is a monument about walking, and just to show you how much he was thinking about it in his drawings, the most basic human condition of autonomy. Its long perspectival gaze is not from above, a la Monet or Pissarro. The large scale of the figures allows the artist to be part of the scene he represents. The figures are represented at nighttime, enveloped in a darkness that reduces the distinction between figures and environment, recalling Seurat's atmospheric drawings. The work's diagonal lean is extraordinary. It was made in the same period as Rodin's backward-leaning Balzac, but Rosso's work was made leaning so far forward that it had to be attached to the ceiling of his studio. You can see the metal wires. In pushing his figures forward, Rosso gave the viewer the conception of movement away from a center, a phenomenological modern sensation of mobility, of time quickly passing by, a now that is always in motion. The figures are turned away from the viewer. No direct visual engagement with them is possible. Rosso shifts the question of identity and personality to the back. These anonymous figures, connected by being in the same time and place, are walking together, but there is one who is separated from the group, creating the possibility of unstable and multiple visions. Thank you. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Carolyn Levitt. Dr. Levitt is associate lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art and has previously taught at the universities of York, Bristol, and Queen Mary. She specializes in relationships between art and literature in France in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her particular research interests include the poetry of Guillaume Apollinaire, surrealism, relationships between sculpture and poetry, book illustrations, the architecture and varied artistic practices of Le Corbusier, and artists working in media beyond easel painting in tapestry, ceramic, and stained glass. She's published articles in Papers of Surrealism and Nottingham French Studies, and contributed to books and edited volumes, including Faden's The Art Museum and Art in Time. Her current research project centers on artists and sculptors who have owned books and drawn over them, situating this fascinating practice in the context of a broader history of the avant-garde.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this study. It's a real privilege, and I think we're going to learn a lot from each other. I found Sharon's talk fascinating, probably not least because I think there is a little bit of overlap with my own, and I'm just trying to work out how to get onto the slides of my own. Just bear with me for a moment. There we go. That looks very hopeful. There we go. So I'm coming at Rosso very much from the angle of someone who is interested in the way that Apollinaire writes about him and the way that his work might be considered in relation to poetry or the poetic. I'll begin with a quote for you. The death of Rodin did not cause art critics to speak again about Medardo Rosso, who is now, beyond a doubt, the greatest living sculptor. The injustice of which this prodigious sculptor has always been a victim is not about to be repaired. Meanwhile, Medardo Rosso works in silence in Paris. In the quiet of his studio, he evokes the aspect of those Renaissance artists who were both sculptors and casters, masters and workmen at the same time, doing everything themselves. Medardo Rosso has not submitted new works to the judgment of the public for a long time. He is contemplating modelling the figure of a horse. This passage, written by Apollinaire 8 months after Rodin's death, has been endlessly but selectively cited to justify Medardo Rosso's importance in the lineage of modern sculpture. The wall text of the current exhibition at the Galerie Thaddaeus Ropac proudly declares that Apollinaire called Rosso the greatest living sculptor, and Margaret Barr began her seminal 1963 monograph on Rosso with the same quotation, commenting wryly that Apollinaire's unqualified superlative will charm the ears of Rosso's admirers, but it may shock those who know that during the decade before the First World War, Apollinaire, champion of Cubism, had been the sword and shield of the avant-garde. Apollinaire's words seem surprising but pleasing. The great supporter of the Cubists should surely be preserving such an accolade for the likes of Duchamp, Brancusi, Archipenko, or even Picasso himself, all artists whom he admired and defended during his lifetime, and the sculpture of whom helped to change the course of 20th century art in undeniable ways. Here, though, Apollinaire selects Rosso, presenting him as a figure relegated to the margins, from which we seem to have been trying to pull him ever since. He evokes his practice of casting his own sculptures as part of a self-fashioned personality that chimes with that of Brancusi, and he is blunt about Rosso's lack of new work in recent years. We cannot, therefore, put Apollinaire's claim for Rosso down to an ignorance of his non-production, as some have tried to, or brush it aside as a throwaway superlative. This paper will unpack Apollinaire's peculiar little article, showing it to be both astute and intentional, at once a provocation and a demonstration of themes that are dear to Apollinaire and that he layers on to Rosso's work. In these few sentences, Apollinaire claims for Rosso a complicit attitude to modernity and the monumental, which I will look to test by placing Rosso's sculptures in relation to Apollinaire's own experimentation with form and language in his Calicram, and attempting a new veil of interpretation through them. The importance of silence and contemplation to Apollinaire's concept of both sculpture and monument is exemplified in his writing and in his encounters with artists, Medardo Rosso being a case in point. I'll give you a picture to look at. Moving on to this in a moment. The first thing to note is that both Rosso and Apollinaire fit quite neatly into a conventional understanding of the passage between 19th and 20th century modernity. Baudelaire's literary legacy and the lineage from Rodin in the case of sculpture are the obvious contexts for Apollinaire and Rosso, respectively. It was in relation to Rodin that Apollinaire often spoke of Rosso, and Rosso himself made the comparison in a somewhat competitive manner, not least at the 1904 Salon d'Automne, which we saw a moment ago, where his sculptures were placed in conversation with photos of Rodin's works, and also with Impressionist paintings. At the 1906 Crometti exhibition in London, Rosso deliberately included one of Rodin's works amongst his own, affording a comparison rather like the one effected in the current exhibition between Rosso and Cragg. This, of course, deliberately signifies Rosso's influence forwards to contemporary sculpture, and we could put in Cragg's place Giacometti, Fautrier, Moore, or many others. If the comparison with Rodin speaks to Rosso's anti-monumentality in terms of subject, form, and surface, the rough surfaces and non-heroic compositions of sculptures such as Balzac being the most obvious markers of this, then the legacy of Baudelaire can be most readily seen in the transitory nature of Rosso's imagery and materials, and in the sense of flânerie suggested by quick sketches of the street and sculptures such as Impression de Boulevard, Femme à la Voilette. The comparison has been made before between this sculpture and Baudelaire's poem À une passante, with its description of an enigmatic woman in a crowded city street. The contemplative silence of the flaneur, seeing but unseen, is key to the contention of the current exhibition. Apollinaire explicitly situated himself within the tradition of flânerie in his text Le Flâneur des Deux Rives of 1918. In an early section of this text, Apollinaire walks along the Rue La Fontaine and draws his reader's attention to a long, sombre grey wall with a heavy door that leads to a courtyard where several hens parade solemnly. The courtyard is full of statues, notably one that seems to be by Rosso. Rosso thus forms a part of Apollinaire's semi-imagined, slightly absurd Museum of the Street, which also houses a forest of lampposts. Apollinaire's peregrinations deliberately take in the anti-monumental, the amusing, and the peculiar, as do Rosso's unconventional sculptural subjects, hidden, in Apollinaire's conjuration at least, in the shadows and unknown corners of the city. Apollinaire, Boccioni, and plenty of authors since have noted the importance of sculptures like Femme à la Voilette for the development of early Cubist and Futurist sculpture, notably sculptures such as these. I'm showing you Picasso's Head of a Woman of 1909 and Boccioni's Anti-Graceful of 1913. The play of light across the skin, the interaction between form and environment, and the appearance of distortions of transient sight are all present in these sculptures. And while Picasso's analytical fragmentation of form is somewhat removed from Boccioni's insistence on animation, the relevance of Rosso's melting textured surface and his use of deep recesses to create dramatic shadows emphasizing the forms of his surface resonate with both of these examples. Apollinaire and Rosso's own opinions of futurism were not wholly positive, of course, and Peter Reed has shown how in his discourse on sculpture, Apollinaire provocatively expresses admiration for both the nude as a genre and for the victory at Samothrace, implicitly rejecting two key tenets of the Futurist manifesto. Reed understands Apollinaire's many evocations of monumental sculpture in both his fiction and his writing on art to stand for a symbolic and material resistance to the fateful passage of time and things. Apollinaire's stance, though, is, as ever, ambiguous and oscillatory. He shifts between praising sculptures such as François Rude, Henri Bouchard, and Jules Desbois, working in a classicizing and heroic mode, and deliberately undermining their monumentality. In a lecture given on the 7th of June 1913, shortly before the opening of the futurist exhibition en Rue la Boétie, Apollinaire rethinks sculpture in a variety of ways. Firstly, he recalls Raymond Roussel's sculptural and mechanical props in his Impression d'Afrique, expressing a disappointment in the fact that the renewal of art promised in that play has not since been effected as hoped. Sculpture, he says, was renewed only with words. He goes on to commend Negro sculpture for its resistance to mimesis and narrative, and its use of contradictory form, rounds to stand for voids, voids rendered by reliefs, to conceive of a new type of reality, praise that would be echoed in his explanations of Picasso's work. And he calls for a sculpture created from light, fire, and transparency, concerns that quite explicitly fit with the way that Rosso described physical existence as plays of light in space. Finally, in establishing a place for Rosso as a precursor to modern sculpture, we should not ignore Rosso's insistence on the process of making, on his direct approach to casting, and his choice to preserve within finished pieces evidence of imperfections in material and technique. This sense of authenticity, coupled with the visible hollow backs of his frontal or even relief sculptures, as one, provide him a place perhaps not only as a descendant of Rodin's less radical approach to surface, but also alongside direct carvers such as Epstein and Brancusi. Brancusi's use of series and repetition, his experimentation with different media for the same subject, and his willingness to endlessly cast his own work is another important correlation that has often been noted between Rosso and the concerns of modernity. If Rosso had presented no new works to public judgment since 1906, this need not be seen as an accusation on Apollinaire's part, but as evidence of Rosso's engagement with the concerns of reproduction and even the ready-made that were starting to replace the conventions of sculpture by the time Apollinaire was writing in 1918. The creation of new forms rather than the imitation of existing ones, either through the synthesis of forms, through experimentation with media, or through claiming existing objects in new contexts, is key to the discourse of 20th century sculpture, of which Apollinaire was a principal interlocutor. Reproduction and non-production were key to creation. There remains one sentence of Apollinaire's article that we are yet to broach, that rather strange assertion at the end that Rosso is contemplating making the figure of a horse. If we're to take Apollinaire literally, then we must infer that he must have met Rosso in his studio and was told of his plans for a new project. However, there is no record of any such meeting, and to my knowledge, Rosso never did sculpt a horse, so to do so, in fact, would have been out of character, to say the least. Indeed, as we have said, he did not make any new works even after Apollinaire's death, just a few months after the publication of the Europe Nouvelle article. The claim that Rosso is contemplating sculpting the figure of a horse could be read in a number of ways. Perhaps it is a tongue-in-cheek comment on public judgment. He hasn't produced anything for years, so he will go back to an older tradition of equestrian sculpture that will please the punters. Or perhaps the emphasis is on contemplation over production. However, I think it is far more likely that Apollinaire is drawing from his own frames of reference here, and that the horse is a symbol for something central to Apollinaire's understanding of Rosso, a further signal to his anti-monumentality. There are a number of horses might be recalled at this point that can help us in our reinterpretation. Duchamp-Villon's mechanized horse, with its rider removed since an earlier version, Cappiello's image of vulnerability, uncannily selected as the cover image for Apollinaire's semi-autobiographical Roman à Clé before Apollinaire sustained his head wound at the front in March 1916. Picasso's elegant Pegasus horses, an image of hope and perhaps nostalgia, or a somewhat transgressive call to order in the context of the wartime ballet Parade, and Apollinaires' own calligramme in the shape of a horse, used in the catalogue of an exhibition of the work of Léopold Sauvage and Irène Lagu. All of these are of significance to Apollinaire for reasons that there is not time to fully expound here, but crucially, all stand for a resistance to heroic equestrian portraits, some more obviously than others. Both Apollinaire's text about Raymond Duchamp-Villon, printed as an appendix to the Cubist painters, and Le Poète Assassiné have much to tell us about Apollinaire's attitude to sculpture. We will come to Le Poète Assassiné in due course. In his piece on Duchamp-Villon, Apollinaire denigrates large monuments such as the pyramids, which are far too large for their purpose. The world, he says, is covered with monuments that are completely useless. For Duchamp-Villon, Apollinaire says, light is the only thing that counts. He thus situates him within his discourse on modern sculpture elsewhere. If in the conventional equestrian monument the horse is intended to raise the hero from the ground, then a horse with no rider becomes a sort of empty plinth. It is in these terms that Willard Bon has also described Apollinaire's horse calligram, suggesting that the signature of Apollinaire takes the place of both the title and the absent rider. Thus the text, denoting a new form of representation that is more modern and more poetic than that which has come before, could just as easily refer to Apollinaire's own poetry as to the works in the exhibition for which it was used. Likewise, Duchamp-Villon's Horse Without a Rider is evocative in the context of the sculptor's experience in the cavalry during the war and his own death in 1918. It becomes a monument to absence in its own right, especially perhaps when it is enlarged and cast in bronze at the direction of none other than Duchamp-Villon's brother, Marcel Duchamp, after his death. I'm showing you the 1914 plaster deliberately because this is the piece that Apollinaire would have known. To return to Rosso, it is in the realm of funerary monuments, as we heard from Sharon, that his resistance to equestrian portraits is most readily seen. When he presented a submission for the Milan monument to Garibaldi in 1882, he did not include a horse. He focused on tragedy and mourning rather than on the heroic. And as Sharon Hecker has put it, Rosso used an artistic language of protest to experiment with new forms of expression that rejected the heroic idioms of traditional sculpture. I'm afraid I don't have an image for you of Rosso's submission, but I do have one of the monument that was ultimately erected, and very heroic it is too. So the image of the never-made horse sculpture becomes a metaphor for a resistance to academic trends. But I would suggest that the links to Apollinaire's calligram do not end there. Apollinaire takes an experimentally plastic approach to language, presenting words in a manner that is first and foremost visual. In so doing, he disrupts legibility and disorientates the reader, who researches for a logical place to start and finish, and is forced to change the angle at which he views the page in order to decipher the text. Whilst we might claim this as the visual equivalent of Cubism, we could also compare it to Rosso, not least in his own experimental forms of text, in his writings and letters. This is described in the catalogue for the current exhibition in terms of a confusion of language and a disruption of the linearity of text. However, at a deeper level, Rosso was continually disrupting the legibility of his sculptures as he reframed them by casting, cropping, and photographing them. And if we take L'Enfant au Sein as an exemplar, we can note the shifts in perspective, the effect of removing the head of the mother, the peculiar angles of the photographs that result in the disintegration and abstraction of the image, and the alterations effected by the change in medium. Rosso's sculptures, then, are reinvented as much through formal language as through matter, just as Apollinaire reinvents language through the use of words as visual signifiers. In using the processes of reproduction, casting in Rosso's case and printing in Apollinaire's, both sculptor and writer choose to preserve the marks and even imperfections of the handmade or handwritten, perhaps as markers of authenticity, but perhaps as evidence once again that reproduction is itself a process of creation within a new context. When the calligram was reproduced in the journal L'Esprit Nouveau in 1924, it would take on quite a new meaning. The repetition and fragmentation that Rosso effects could be seen in the light of what Rosalind Krauss, in talking about Brancusi's work, has termed part objects. In removing the head of the woman from L'Enfant au Sein, for example, Rosso creates a new and unspecific meaning for the work, resisting the possibility of reading it biographically as a portrait of his wife and their son, and also removing it from the context of traditional images of maternity that rely on the look exchanged between mother and child. Perhaps the riderless horse, or maybe even Pegasus, of Apollinaire's calligram becomes itself a part object. Krauss has also commented, in relation to Rosso this time, on the importance of shadow and the in-between space in Rosso's sculptures. We can see that in L'Enfant au Sein, for example, where the shadow and depth of relief between the child's hand and the mother's breast serves to delineate the three-dimensionality of forms and the spatial relationship between them. It is to the spaces in between that I will now turn our discussion. The use of in-between spaces is key to a work like The Conversation, which I am showing you here photographed against two different backgrounds in order to reinforce the predominance of negative space in this sculpture. And I was intrigued a moment ago when Sharon showed the photographs of Impression de Boulevard Paris de Nuit to see that actually he had sketched in some of the negative space in between the sculptures. Maybe we can come back to that. Narratively, it is the spaces between the figures that articulates their relationship. And whilst this particular conversation has often been understood to be silent, any language that might be articulated could be said to be taking place in the space between the figures. One of Rosso's own photographs of this sculpture places the negative space at the centre of the photographic composition, abstracting the image so that it becomes a study in form and space, light and shadow. The placement of forms in space in order to infer relational distances and formal narratives has been important to many sculptors since Rosso, Barbara Hepworth, for example, or Hans Arp. And the space between was fundamental to Apollinaire's descriptions of Cubism, but also to his own poetic oeuvre. The very first sentence of this concrete poem reads, "See this painter, he takes things with their shadows intact, and in the blink of a sublimatory eye, he tears himself up into deep and agreeable chords to breathe like the organ that I love to hear." Apollinaire's rather florid prose hints at both the importance of negative and immaterial space, shadows, and also the metaphor of sound to stand for the harmonious relationships between forms that result from breaking things up. If we look purely visually at the composition, we can see that Apollinaire has provided us, in the gaps between the text, with distorted shapes, some of which seem to stand for images loosely referenced in the words that surround them. Flames, a guitar on its side, and perhaps even an inkwell. The possibility of reading a poem like this only visually, but the dangers of doing so, are thrown into relief if we compare it to a composition like Picasso's famous Glass and Bottle of Suze, where for many years the text of the newspaper columns, so politicised in its content, remained unread. If the empty spaces between forms are sometimes the most articulate in both sculpture and experimental poetry, perhaps it would be pertinent to close this discussion with recourse to Apollinaire's Roman à clé, le poète assassiné, the assassinated poet. In chapter 14 of the text, Rencontres, or Encounters, the poet Croniat-Montal meets the bronze statue of François Coppée, a French poet and playwright who had died in 1908. His monument is a conventional sculpture, too old, as the Oiseau du Bénin, the character that represents Picasso, will label all such sculptures in the final chapter of the novel. The real monument, the figure of Coppée in a walking pose, was inaugurated on the Avenue de Villiers, although ironically, or perhaps appropriately, the bronze figure was removed under the German occupation, and what remains is an empty plinth with a small cameo on the side, a monument to absence. In Apollinaire's narrative, even Coppée himself is disappointed in his legacy, engaging in conversation with Croniat-Montal, the figure of the poet. "Dear master, how sombre you seem." He replied courteously, "It is because my statue is made of bronze. It exposes me to constant ridicule." In the final chapter of the novel, the Oiseau du Bénin describes the monument he will erect to the assassinated poet, sculpted from nothing, like poetry and like glory. This is not only, as various critics have suggested, the inspiration for Picasso's wire maquette project for a monument to Apollinaire after his death, but also a response to the staid nature of monuments, such as that of Coppée or indeed Garibaldi. One thing that Apollinaire could not have known was that, like Rosso's submission for the Garibaldi monument and several other funerary projects after that, his own monument, designed for him by Picasso, would be censored and rejected. The succès de scandale, the prize of censorship, and the badge of honour of non-production seem to be further markers of Rosso's modernity. For Apollinaire, then, Rosso's work, silently immaterial, seems to fit with the type of sculpture he advocates in his fiction and his criticism. And when we layer Apollinaire's experimental poetic form onto Rosso's varied sculptural practices, Apollinaire's unqualified superlative begins to make a great deal of sense. Thank you. I think we're moving to discussion now. Is that right? There we go.
It's an incredible paper. Wow. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our discussion panel, and we'll have time for questions as well. Richard Deacon and Philippa Barlow and Carolyn and myself as moderator. Just to introduce our two panel members. Phyllida Barlow was born in 1944 in Newcastle upon Tyne. She lives and works in London. Her key solo exhibitions include Artist Rooms, Phyllida Barlow at Turner Contemporary, Margate, and Demo at Kunsthalle Zurich, and Tris at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, Texas, Set at the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh, Doc at the Duveen Commission at Tate Britain, G. Hauser and Worth, Somerset, and Phyllida Barlow, 50 Years of Drawing, Hauser and Worth in London. Barlow studied at Chelsea College of Art and the Slade School of Art. After joining the staff in the 1980s, Barlow taught at the Slade School of Art for more than 20 years before retiring in 2009, and she is now Emerita Professor of Fine Art. In 2011, Barlow became a Royal Academician, and in 2015, she was made a CBE for her services in the arts in the Queen's New Year's honor. In 2012, Barlow received the Aachen Art Prize, an award for the most significant contribution to the development of contemporary art at the first International Kiev Biennale in Ukraine. Barlow represented Great Britain at the Biennale in Venice in 2017 with a major solo show in the British Pavilion. She will next unveil 2 major commissions, one for the High Line in spring 2018 and the other at Jupiter Artland in May 2018. Our second distinguished artist is Richard Deacon, whose voluptuous abstract forms have placed him at the forefront of British sculpture since the 1980s, and hugely influential. His works are visible in major public commissions around the world. His voracious appetite for material has seen him move between laminated wood, stainless steel, corrugated iron, polycarbonate, marble, clay, vinyl, foam, and leather, as if each sculpture were defined by contrast to its successor. As he explained in an interview in 2005, changing materials from one work to the next is a way of beginning again each time, and thus of finishing what has gone before. Deacon describes himself as a fabricator, emphasizing the construction behind the finished object, although many of the works are indeed cast, modeled, or carved by hand, and accordingly, the logic of fabrication is often exposed. Sinuous, curved forms might be bound by glue oozing between layers of wood, or have screws and rivets protruding from sheets of steel, wearing their hearts on their sleeves. Such transparency highlights the reactive nature of the process. It is part of the two-way conversation between artist and material that transforms the workaday into something metaphorical. The idea of fabrication also denotes making something up, of fiction rather than truth, and this knack for wordplay surfaces in Deacon's titles, which might establish juxtapositions or wreak new meanings from familiar sayings or cliches, such as "let's not be stupid," "no stone unturned," or "water under the bridge." So I think we should begin our discussion. Maybe, would you like to begin? Thinking about things that we've been talking about so far?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Ladies.
Yes, I maybe would begin with just questioning the word impressionism in relationship to Rosso. I'd like to see what the response might be to that, because I suppose the thing that appealed to me right from the off, Richard first encountered Rosso in 1969. I think I encountered him in 1962, and I think it was in the context of discussing casting and mold making and how you find the edge with sculpture. And I think I found that absolutely intriguing, that maybe sculpture is defined by its edges, but if you start to question that because of the processes of these liquid to solid materials, plaster, wax, and even clay, you're entering a realm where your decisions completely contrast with the decisions that appear to be in the world around you. So there's immediately a kind of conflict, but it has nothing to do with impressionism. It's the opposite. It's making very clear decisions where the material itself has enormous authority and enormous sense of its own power. You know, working with materials in a liquid state, you've got to be able to develop an adept relationship with that, where on one hand, as Louise Bourgeois said, plaster, you have to let it do what it wants to do. You know, once it's decided to set, there's no way you can stop that process. And the same with wax. And it's interesting, I think in your text, you quote him as saying that he never actually touched the wax. It was never a material that he molded. I found that absolutely fascinating, that he used it as a pouring material, so that this whole relationship again with touch becomes very volatile. And I would like to make a comparison between Rosso and Louise Bourgeois, Eva Hesse and Germaine Richier. I'm not just choosing women because trying to inject a feminist stance here, but I think there's a really important relationship with their notions of touch. And we can open that out. I think Eva Hesse very rarely touched her work because she was using such lethal materials. So in a way, her touch was quite cold, even though the work is boiling hot. So I think there's a wonderful paradox there. That I also wanted to look at the idea of things, his work having the qualities of incompleteness, and what that means in terms of sculpture, what it means in terms of the contemporary language of sculpture, where maybe completeness equates to some extent with commercial traits. You know, people don't want to buy things that are apparently half finished or going to fall to bits or whatever it is. But I think he stands out as somebody who made incompleteness into a statement in its own right, that it's not a condition of being unsure or uncertain, quite the opposite. It's a place where you've arrested the processes because there is no more to go on with. The idea of finish is in the moment, in a moment of time. And that's what brings me maybe to the next relationship. I'll stop in a minute, which is the idea of syntax, which I just mentioned to you. How do we look at sculpture? Do we look at sculpture as a quality that has the future tense? It's something that's going to happen. I always felt that about Bruce Naumann's chairs, you know, that something was going to happen. They were in the future tense. Whereas I think for me, there are many works that seem to continue to be in the present tense. And for me, Medardo Rosso is one of them. And I can't exactly explain that. It's slightly fanciful to use this, but there's a feeling that the thing is only just there. It's only just existing. And we've caught it at this particular moment of its existence. And I think a lot of sculpture inhabits that quality of the past tense. For me, maybe a lot of Giacometti does. I expect people to argue with this idea, but that's, I think I'll leave it there. I've got a lot I would want to say about the photography as well. Maybe I'll just say one more thing, that the image of the conversation, where the figure on the left is in black, silhouetted. The figure on the right is bleached white. These two states of, one is like blindness and the other is like the solid silhouette that puts sculpture into, both are in quite non-sculptural renditions. So it's somewhere in between that you were talking about as well, that I think that the sculptural as a language exists, but it fascinates me, Rosso's relationship with photography. I think it's absolutely as though he is trying to make sculpture have all the qualities that it doesn't have. It's trying to give it movement and a kind of living warmth, and allowing the light to do that around the work.
It isn't isn't the kind of photography that, of course, for a younger audience, then they think of photography differently. But for Rosso, and we're assuming that he did his own processing. The photography is a liquid process. It's not a so even the production of the negative is a kind of liquid process, and the addition, the kinds of paper that he printed on, make me think that he prepared his own paper. So he had something like some liquid process for sensitizing paper, liquid emulsion to sensitize the paper, so that and then the process is always a transfer between wet and dry when you're processing a photograph and fixing it, so that all of that is goes along with what you say about liquidity in the material. So there's some nice overlap between that liquidity and the thing. I agree with what you say about edges. That's, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree with the idea that that's not an impression. That somehow that I don't really. That if you're if you're working in photography where you're not, I don't know quite why that isn't an impression, but that's or why a cast isn't an impression.
A cast is very like photography.
Yeah, but is that not an impression?
I was yes, it is, but I think impressionism and
impression are two different things.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. Impressionism seems to go into a slightly vague area, as though things are approximate, whereas I think Rosso's work is incredibly exact and precise in all its handling of these volatile materials.
I think one of the things that Roger Fry always had an issue with Impressionism was that you couldn't see the lines. We'd lost the lines under the flurry of colours and brush marks. And I think probably what Rosso does with the photography in particular is to bring back that edge. And I think it's interesting to think of photography as a liquid process alongside sculpture as a liquid process. And actually you don't touch the photograph as you're developing it either. That is also a non-touched process. Whereas the brushwork and the handling of the paint with Impressionism does seem very much touched. So I think there is a distinction there. And I wonder if there's something to be said, perhaps. For my part, I encountered Medardo Rosso for the first time, I think, in relation to Futurism many years back when I visited the Esteric collection. I think it was probably the first Rosso I ever saw. And so my approach to it has always come from that comment that Boccioni makes about the effect of matter on the environment and the environment on matter, and the way that the one touches the other. So I wonder if there's a sense in which the sculptures aren't touched by fingers, but they're touched by the space around them. And that strikes me as maybe a way of situating him slightly differently from Impressionism. I don't know if that's helpful or not. But,
yeah, he says something very interesting in the catalogue. In the catalogue to show there's little bits of Rosso's writing, and he's he says something very interesting about the not wanting to make stuff you can go around, wanting only to make sculpture that you stood in front of. And he says we should no longer make any of those things that nobody's ever seen. That stuff made for going around. It is cold, objective stuff. An effect is linked to another effect. There is a single point of view because there is a single coloration and a single emotion. If you want to divide it, limit it, change it, you cannot. We do not exist. We are only plays of light in space. But actually, they're really interesting because they do have backs, and they do stand in space. And as an artist, you do go round the back, and you do look at it, and then once you've done that, your kind of any anxieties you might have about finishing or kind of how something should be are kind of totally destroyed, really, because it doesn't. That's not. That kind of not what it's not what it's about. That you so the backs of Medardo Rosso sculptures are interesting because they're totally miasmic. They're kind of kind of nothing and something at the same, nothing and something at the same time. And you can see in that photograph of the a quite nice photograph of the studio when he's standing up at the back behind the screen. So there's all those sculptures, but he's looking at the backs of them all. And he's kind of little pixies, and he's looking at the backs of them all. The other thing was, I wasn't quite sure you were fair to Rodin on the burghers of Calais, particularly, because actually the proposition from Rodin wasn't that they were on the ground, and they were, the original proposition was that they were walking outside, and they were placed on the ground. That the situation that you see in the cast down in Westminster isn't the original situation. The original situation was that they were in the same space as you, and that they were Rodin's obviously different from Rosso, and obviously there is a certain amount of rivalry on the part of Rosso to very interesting rivalry. That process of substituting photographs in the Salon d'Automne is kind of really is very nice, and that sort of that kind of play of appropriation and all the rest of it, which is very contemporary, is very good. Although there are the failure of commissions is, a kind of strong the ability to fail at making commissions is a source of strength for Rodin. So kind of not achieving commissions is even for the Balzac, or all the cast for the Balzac, and then the way in which the age of the Gates of Hell was kind of worked out as there being a kind of resource. So that failed monumentality and is equally creative in Rodin as it is in Rosso, although in kind of different ways. And there is, we were talking before about, there are also overlaps, so that because Rosso is casting himself and all that stuff, there's all those kind of accidents and fissures and mistakes that kind of come in, then that also does exist in Rodin, but in a slightly different way. So in the with odd bits being kind of left behind, and casting faults being the kind of nodule on Baudelaire's forehead, or for example, or the Eve with the kind of bits of the mould at the side, and the Earth, Song of the Earth, with a kind of cuts down along the knees. These are and some of the mismatches in the kind of collages. They're all kind of although Rodin also brings in enlargement and reduction is less a feature of Rosso's sculptural practice, although it is a feature of the drawings and the photographs of the drawings. But there are never, he doesn't use scale, a change of scale in relationship to the sculpture at all. They're always either, there's three scales, aren't there? There's at a distance, as in the conversation. There's life size, as in the various portraits, and then there's kind of full size in the sense of none of the failed. The last one you showed, for example, the Boulevard. Those are life size. Those are life size figures. The others are fragmentary in life size, but and kind of capture. But you don't. But they're in a separate space from you, whereas that last one seems to possibly exist in the same space as you. Though the funerary monuments are terrifically kitsch. The first one is kind of tremendously kitsch. The kind of woman on the ground there. The other two are pretty extraordinary. They're still there, are they? Yeah. With particularly for the composer, I thought it was fantastic. I've not seen that. The Rosso surfaces. I've just seen a couple of Rossos in the Nasher and Dallas. One of which was cleaned, and that's a mistake. They shouldn't be cleaned. And the other which was nice and dirty. They seem to benefit from, they do benefit from being dirty. And when I first saw them, I think they were quite dusty, dirt and dusty, because the wax kind of yellows and there's kind of gets all that dirt in, and they look, and those, which in a way is not unlike the way that echoes, in a sense, the way that casts were treated in the old academies when they were left to get dusty in order to, and also treated with milk to give them this kind of slightly creamy surface. But so there is something of that, I think, in the way that Rosso treats it. But until you kind of talked about the liquidity, I'd never really understood, because I'd always slightly thought that the wax was applied afterwards, rather than it being the first thing that was put on.
There's a long association of the hand with wax and the warm hand melting wax, and these play into that as well. But then he breaks up the idea by actually changing his process.
And it oddly gives them a very tactile quality,
Yes,
doesn't it? For
yes.
something that is untouched in the process, there's something very tactile about wax and a warmth to it.
So was the wax poured into a plaster mould?
Gelatin.
Gelatin mould, and then backed up with plaster while
Yeah.
still
Yes, that's what she's saying.
And then readjusted with more plaster for exhibition purposes. Maybe if there are any questions from the audience or any comments, that would be wonderful. How are we doing on time? Okay.
The other one question I wanted to say was, Rosso in relation to photography, I had two questions. Rosso in relation to photography obviously brings up Brancusi, more than it does Rodin, but because Brancusi is also processing his own photographs. And they kind of knew each other, didn't they, sort of?
So Brancusi arrives in Paris to see the Salon d'Automne, those photos that I showed.
Yeah.
And he becomes quite enamored of Rosso's works. And his first works actually look very much like Rosso.
Yeah.
The Sleeping Child.
Yeah.
and
Well, Madame X is the one that's very interesting, because
that one comes much later.
yeah,
I mean, it's made
but
earlier,
Rosso's Madame X is actually, it's not unlike Brancusi's Madame X.
Now, Brancusi's was shown in 1913 at the Armory Show, and then Rosso's, the first time he exhibits it is 1 year later, but he makes it much earlier. So, of course, there's a connection, of course.
Mm.
And of course, these images of himself in the studio resonate very much with Brancusi's own representation of himself in the studio in different ways. Is somebody else? Two.
Philida and I were talking about the show, and Philida, you mentioned Rosso as a painter. You talked about Rosso and painting, and it was such an interesting idea, and it would be fantastic if you could just talk a little bit more about that now.
I think it's quite a sort of obvious interpretation or response to his work, that there seems to be something where there is an ideal point of view from the front, and this thing of walking round the back, which is something that I can't help doing, and I'm always interested in the way sculpture is displayed, so often quite close to walls, so you can't get round the back of them. But I think it was Rodin who said, work on the front and the back will look after itself. And I think there's something about Rosso's work that is like that, you know, that the backs do seem to look after themselves. And the way the plaster, in a way, inherits all the qualities of being a mould, that's, the thing is kind of coming out of the world, out of the mould. They're very emerging, as objects, and that, to me, has a kind of painterly quality. I don't think they're particularly pictorial, but I think there's a feeling that they're very much worked from the front and not necessarily worked so much in the round, although I think some of them are. But I don't have a great deal to say about it, other than I think there is this sense that the materials, I mean, you mentioned the touch, but painters work with things that are often quite remote from the hand. And I think in some ways this is a terrific economy in his use of these materials that I think also, to me, has something of a painterly quality about it.
The really interesting thing is, if you look at the back of many Rosso sculpture, you can really see the hand, the evidence.
Exactly.
So you've got this kind of duality of how
Yeah.
he makes the work, and yet the bit that you're not supposed to
See is the most.
It's the bit that he's
Yes.
worked on, yeah.
Yes, see the
That's
finger
fist mark.
marks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think which is really fascinating is this business of perception. It seems so much that Rosso perception is such a key part of his work, is that you see something like Left Arm, My Love, My Left, the largest sculpture in the show, and it's so present when you see it face on. It has to be seen that way, and yet behind there's all the hand marks that you see as a pencil almost tearing away the plaster. And then the key thing, which is that it's incredibly thin, so it's almost like a giacometic inside. So there are these kind of counter-intuitive elements to his sculpture that are quite surprising when he so consistently forces the viewer to look at the
The front.
from the front.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's, sorry.
No, if you think about his drawings also on the backs of envelopes, the backs of restaurant cards, front
Yeah,
and
yeah.
back is always being played with, and the edge. I don't know if you saw in mine where the mold, where material leaks out of the mold, and he keeps it as a kind of a halo to show you where front and edge is.
Yes, I mean, just
It's a very good one in the book
Yes,
there,
that one as well.
which is
which
a
one?
glass negative
Oh, yeah.
surrounded by bits of card torn from kind of stiff stationery from London hotels, and because it's a negative, it's kind of pops out in a kind of pops out in relief, the way that a negative does when you hold it up. It's, and that's where the edges are edges are adjusted with that kind of torn thing, and then you've got little bits of image down the bottom. It's
Yeah.
and in this very curious picture, which is itself a negative, is it not?
Yes.
So this is and this is his photograph. So it's his photograph of a negative mounted. It's his negative of a photograph of a negative. Okay.
But I think the apparent two-sidedness is incredibly sculptural.
Yes.
I think I'm not in any way saying that because the layering, the flatness that he uses is unspatial. I think it's so sensitive to space because of that.
It's like
Yes,
that, isn't it?
that
like
compression,
this little gap.
Yes, yeah.
It does also suggest some of that incompleteness that you were mentioning, and that you can't, it's a bit like a flat earth, isn't it? You can't walk around to the back without the illusion being destroyed, the illusion of three-dimensionality, because they are actually reliefs as opposed to sculptures in an exact sense. And I wonder if that, you were talking about temporality and syntax, and I wonder if that somehow affects their temporality a little bit. Often with a sculpture, there's a sense in which you experience it over time because you walk around the thing and you experience different sides at different points in time. So there's a real time to it. And that isn't afforded with a Rosso because you can't walk around it in quite that way. But he does think about time, I suppose, in relation to the temporality of a material and the way that that changes over time. And you were mentioning the sacrilege of cleaning. And I think there is one cleaned in the show, isn't there? And it's really interesting to see that in relation to the uncleaned version of that same sculpture. The one that looks pristine and immediate as though it's only just been created, and the one that's had a life I think the life of a surface is very interesting. We can see that with Cubist collage, I suppose, as well. All sorts of things that exist within time. So I don't know if that helps to start thinking about syntax at all. But,
Sharon, I'm interested in relation to this discussion about time, about what, I mean, to know from you about Rosso's working day and indeed his working habits, because it's extraordinary to me that there are so few sculptures, you could say, and that rather like Rodin, he made mass production of some things. So Bambino Abreu, for example, there are many, many examples of it, and it's clear that he made casts of it throughout his life. And I just wondered what your what your studies have revealed in both aspects, daily work and then the need to continually remake an earlier piece.
So in terms of daily work, we really don't have studio records. We don't have assistants, as in real his Rodin or people who watched him work. It was a very secret, private process, so we do not have a daily log of how he worked. And most people in his time who write about him also don't have. In fact, Apollinaire is a very strange, again, not knowing what his daily life is like. In terms of his own need to keep going back and rethinking and reworking, that goes on all the way till the end of his life. So it is a very interesting question of time, standing still and moving forward as well. That's one of the big questions of Rosso. There was a recent essay that just came out in the Pulitzer catalog about the question of the long time it takes to look at these sculptures, and at the same time the idea that they should be taken in an instant. Like he says, what I want to recapture, what makes an impression on me, and at that moment, that instant of looking. On the other hand, they take a long time to take in, and they take emotionally, visually, physically. So there is this dual play, I think, with time, and maybe that has to do a little bit with your thinking about liquidity, because that brings you into the question of time. Congealed time and melted.
Yes.
But also just tell Anthony the story you told me about him staying in the hotel, so that which reflects a bit on how you used his time. You know.
Well, so in hotel, for example, he spent 6 months in the hotel in London. At the end of the 6 months, he sends a letter to a friend saying, "I have to pay my bill, so I have to get out and sell some works because I've been here for 6 months." So clearly, also in the hotel room, drawing on hotel stationery, sending streams of letter from the hotel room. For example, his trips to Germany and Austria, you really don't have a sense that he's outside in the city, enjoying the sights, seeing new things. He's in his room a little bit uncomfortable with being a foreigner, and he says it in a few letters, and sending these letters constantly from his room. So this constant working inside the hotel room. In fact, that's why I showed the picture of the Jewish boy on the suitcase, because I think there was an identification with it, and Bob pointed out that there's a drawing of a man making his suitcase. And there is a sense of this itinerant, cosmopolitan. He says, I'm like a Genoese merchant with my wares going and selling around the world to show what I've done. I also think he may very well have taken in his suitcase the smallest thing he could, which would have been a plaster of the Bambino Abreu, and it was very easy to make that even in his hotel room without a foundry. You just had to, powder gelatin and melt your wax, and you could have a nice cast. So I think there is a traveling, mobile aspect to sculpture that's being introduced at that moment as well. Some of this is hypothesis, but it does.
That would work. Yeah, that would work. Yeah, that would work.
But gelatin is absolutely fiendish.
Yes,
if
well,
you've
that's
ever
why
used
people don't use it anymore. Because, and
Okay.
also for him, I think the melting point of the gelatin and the melting point of the wax are so similar that, and you could only do it apparently in the winter. You couldn't make it, and you had to do 6 very fast before the gelatin sort of
it
fell
goes
apart.
mouldy very quickly.
But that's why we have those huge globs of gelatin on the wax, because there was this mismatch in the timing. We should move on. Okay, so thank you both very much.
Thank you. You're great. Okay.
So it is now my pleasure to introduce our second panel, which is called Matter and Dematerialization. It's quite well from what we have just closed on. I'd like to introduce the panel's moderator, Professor Robert Lovely, who kindly accepted to come speak, and
said so far. I was just sort of thinking that, so I thought that the useful thing that I might do would be, in a sense, to bring up the Italian bit, because in a sense it's the thing I know more about, and I noticed that it's kind of like being a bit absent. But this first slide is not about the Italian bit. I was just thinking, it was my experience of going to see the show. I just thought there was something magical about the velvet curtain that one drew in order to enter, not directly into the space of the gallery, but almost into the space of the gallery. And I thought there was something about this act of pulling back the curtain and going in, which immediately created a sort of special sensation of peering, of glimpsing, of going into a space that, that one was, you weren't just opening a door and going off the street and straight into a space or looking through a glass door. So there was something rather magical, I thought. So anybody who's not yet seen the show, I think that, just allow yourself this sensation of entering it. And I think that is actually important for Rosso's work. There's this liminal spaces, the thresholds, the sort of in-between states, and that sort of, I think that sensation of entry for me was very important. But what I really wanted to think about was really Rosso as an Italian, because clearly it's very problematic to him. As Sharon said, he thought of himself as someone who was born in a train. His father worked for the railways. His life was spent a lot of time, obviously, moving around, living out of suitcases. He leaves Milan. He becomes a French citizen later on. Is he really French? Is he Italian? Or is he not even Italian? Is he actually somebody from Piedmont? And there's a very nice sentence, a very nice caption in the wonderful catalogue, which are translated there. Now I mentioned the translation is huge. It's just put the translator's note, and it's on page 6-7, and it's aligned to it is a picture of a letter, and the letter's got the text that was shown by Caroline earlier on. The text going. And this is aligned with the words by Medardo Rosso, which is in which he talks really about his work. And the translator notes there are a series of flashes of insight continually switch back and forth from Italian to French to dialect, an aspect of expression that could not be captured in English translation here. So I just thought the whole language aspect was quite interesting, because you've got the Italian, you've got the French, you've got the dialect, and then obviously you've got the translation to English, which can't render those things. So there's a sort of problem about speaking, which I think is very interesting, and I think it's a problem that he obviously had. Somebody who never really was in one place, and when he writes, it's very indicative that there are lots of different languages that crop up in the process of writing a sentence. So I think there's something quite important going on there that is worth thinking about. And also there's this inescapability of nationality, particularly if you're Italian at that moment in time. And this is something that the futurists obviously struggled with. You were seen through the eyes of Grand Tour. Effectively, you became a specimen of this country that represented, particularly if you're an artist. And so I think he had a problem with that, against which he struggled. So one of his wonderful statements he makes is, I've had enough of all these Madonnas. I just want ordinary women to be the subjects of the work. He refuses to go to Florence, to the Medici chapel. He clearly at is a bit of him is at war with the Renaissance. And in this, I think you can sort of see him almost as a precursor in a sense of futurism. So everywhere he goes, he's seen as an Italian. He's rebelling against an Italy that he carries with him on his back. At the same time, being an Italian is the thing that will probably help him sell things. You know, when he comes to London, it's clear that this is one of the ways in which he's marketed. And you know, there are probably many, many ways in which he's massively indebted, although he didn't go through official training at the Brera, he leaves after the first year. But nonetheless, there are probably many, many ways in which one can see him as, in a sense, the son of a tradition and the skills of the artisan artist and many other things. And these are things that Sharon discusses wonderfully in her book and also in the catalogue. And I think it is a very interesting aspect, and since it hasn't been mentioned, I just thought it might be useful. But that was my small contribution. I won't mention the other things because I don't think there's time. So I would like to go on. My role is to introduce the others on the panel. I'm not sure what the running is anymore, but let's see. Yes, Sarah Wilson. Sarah. So Sarah Wilson doesn't really need any introduction here. I'm just going to read from the text. So Sarah Wilson is an art historian. I should say that my name is Robert Lumley. I meant to have said that at the very beginning, I think. So for those of you watching this on streamed, anyway, I'm Robert Lumley, and I'm introducing Sarah Wilson, who's an art historian and curator whose interests extend from post-war and Cold War Europe and the USSR to contemporary global art. She was educated at the University of Oxford, BA in English Literature, and at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she took her MA and PhD degrees. She joined the Courtauld Institute faculty in 1982. In 1997, she was appointed Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres for services
As was Richard at the same ceremony. Richard
All right.
Deacon, that's what we have.
Oh, good. For services to French art and culture. Sarah's major publications include Paris, Capital of the Arts, 1900-1968, the Royal Academy, a substantive livre catalogue, and the standard publication on the subject, and Visual World of French Theory, Figurations, the second volume. The Visual World of French Theory 2, Interventions and Preparation, will challenge the Figurations volume with an emphasis on conceptual art, performance, and film. So, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I want your PC first. So while I'm being helped, I'd just like to say that the whole story is not that story, of course. The story is that when I did my MA, I discovered the work of Jean Fautrier, which was absolutely extraordinary, which I'm going to talk about in conjunction with Medardo Rosso. And of course, it is a work, a body of work which requires extreme asceticism. So I've done all these rather horrible subjects about art and politics and Cold War and so forth as a kind of counter practice to my inner aesthete, which is closely related as well to my love of Medardo Rosso. I actually knew Philippe Granville, the French émigré director of the Lord's Gallery, who presumably did in fact procure his Medardo Rossos directly from the family, and who sold the work of certified in, oh thank you Fern, in 1965 to the Tate, the Grande Rieuse, which was subsequently discovered to be a cast made by the son Francesco posthumously, which is probably why you don't ever see any Medardo Rosso at Tate, despite the fact that they have this piece. In terms of just sort of my Medardo Rosso story, which nobody knows about until today, I was also a very close friend and collaborator of Doug Waller, who, to my astonishment, you know, as a trendy New York dealer, not only then embraced John Hartfield, but subsequently, after John Hartfield, Medardo Rosso, much to my extreme delight, and it shows what a great aesthete Doug Waller was. So I have got a secret Medardo Rosso story. I'm going to talk today about Jean Fautrier and point out to you that his enormous retrospective, which is the third for the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, opened only on Wednesday in Paris, and I received this only yesterday evening, and I discovered to my both slight chagrin and delight that everything I wanted to say, as usual, which I have indeed said in other places, but not in a way that percolates to French curators, has not been said. And one of these, this is because all work on Fautrier is entirely in consistency monographical, as though there were no impetuses for his important changes in style. Now, when in 1945, in the Galerie René Drouin, to a rather shocked and astonished public, he exhibited his hostage series. And remember, this was not only just after the Second World War, but in the context of the absolutely vicious and bloodthirsty French epuration, the French purge. The critic André Malraux said the key to all the hostages, which were just like traits of like scars down the face of a massive matter. The key to all the hostages was the great sculpted hostage. And while he called the body of work in general a hieroglyph of pain, it was the leaden colours associated with this hieroglyph of pain that was so important. And you can see the way, if you turn around the sculpted hostage, of which there is a cast, again, not what Fautrier was making during the occupation, of course, there is a cast of the tape. You'll see how, if you turn it around to a certain degree, there is that profile which echoes the line on the hostage. Of course, what I'm going to do is make an analogy with Medardo Rosso, but I'm not simply going to make a stylistic analogy. This is, of course, Etche Puer, and this is a precursor work for Fautrier, the Grande Tête Tragique, the great tragic head, in which his engagement with massacre, and remember, or if you don't know, I'll tell you the story that because he was partly Jewish, not said in the catalogue, and the Nazis had been in his studio, he went and hid in Chateaubriand's house in the Vallée aux Loups, in which he used Chateaubriand's dovecot as a studio, which was against the boundary of the park, and a place where, in fact, the Nazis would bring people to be shot against the boundary wall of the territory, so that he was called a witness of death by his biographer Palmer Buccarelli, who, alas, in those jolly days of the 1960s, did not use the kind of footnoting that we would like. But he was really right up close, listening at night to massacres, rapes, and desecration. So that this idea of the Grande Tête Tragique, which is much more figurative than the ultimate hostage, is very important. This is just to give you a glimpse of Fautrier, and the interesting thing is that he was trained in London at the Royal Academy in the Slade, where he was sent to get away from the pain of his father's death. His mother wanted to change. It's a long story I won't bore you with, but he went to the Royal Academy when he was only 14 years old. The Royal Academy isn't very keen on him, unfortunately, and he then left the Royal Academy in Dudgeon and went off to the Slade, where he studied with Sickert. Now, there's a long story of influences which are formative for Fautrier, which I'm just taking the opportunity of showing you before I get back to Medardo Rosso, just because I have a captive audience. And I think it's so important that, if you like, Medardo Rosso's greatest and most influential héritier is also relatively unknown, unloved. So that, as well as Sickert, with this idea of the body on the mattress, he was introduced to Turner when the Lane bequest opened, which fed straight into his glacier paintings. When he went to Paris, he arrived after being in the war, after his one lung was shot out in 1918. Of course, Turner effects with this incredible reversal of where the head is, the great bores, the anatomy lesson. This was shown during the occupation in the Literati Jean Paulin's place. So this Fautrier, whose macabre precursor is, of course, the Géricault retrospective of the 1930s in terms of decapitated heads, has got all sorts of things which make his art extraordinarily distinctive from the succession we learn when we learn 20th century art history, which of course goes Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, war. It used to go, when I was at the Courtauld, American Abstract Expressionism, pop art, minimalism, art today. Of course, this is why I started devoting myself to European art, just to find out what went on from the late 1930s and in Europe. And in this, of course, if we go back to Fautrier, another very important, and for me one of the most submerged and yet painful references is the palette of Watteau. If you think of the fête galante, instead of ladies and erotic playfulness and picnics in the park, he's listening to these massacres, and this most important work in the Musée de la Ville Paris is called La Juive Otage. He's the only person who makes any work that is explicitly connected to Jewishness in the whole of art in this immediate post-war period. Also, of course, this is a work that has been exhibited with the title Auschwitz, which I think is a posthumous thing, but his use of material, not having access to oil paint, using chemicals and things, and in this one rubbing ash into the nude, I think is extremely important. But I want, of course, to go back to Medardo Rosso and how Rosso feeds himself into the hostages. So why and how did Fautrier turn to sculpture? This is not just simply a Medardo Rosso story, although for me Medardo Rosso is the most important person in that story. So let's imagine that Fautrier, having actually recuperated from his sort of tuberculous situation and his breathing situation in the Alps, hence his glaciers, comes back to Paris in 1918. Now, what's going on at the time is the 4 Degas studio sales, including his experimental wax figurines at the Galerie Georges Petit in 1918 and 1919, and a major sculpture retrospective in the Galerie Hébrard in May-June 1921. We must remember, and you see, of course, Degas' experimental wax figures, which were never cast in bronze. All Degas' bronze sculptures are posthumous casts. These were also extremely deformed, and as they were like thought processes, they were also not properly finished. And we're showing this again. I didn't know it was supposed to have water in it, but this sort of down below thing feeds through, and of course some of these surfaces also one can see in Fautrier's extremely and disturbingly deformed sculpture he starts making round about 1928. In 1919, again, and this is in the wake of Rodin's death and of course all the obituaries, in 1919 the great Musée Rodin opens. And I said here he would have counted notions of unfinished work, form heaving out of and falling back into rough, unhued original stone, and motifs in which extreme and explicit sexual passions, desire, climax, dissolution were linked explicitly with the travail of form within matter. But in April 28, and also in between, you get the opening in 1927 of the Orangerie, where Monet's informel painting of the last great phase is punctuated with Rodin's sculptures. Again, that enormous moment for French art, which impacts on Fautrier, and this idea of an evolution towards informel does not fit in to the orthodox Dada surrealism, you know, dark cubism, surrealism, or even if you do a little bit of 1930s, it's the return to realism. It doesn't fit into things. People do not factor in the formal impact of the Monet-Rodin Orangerie. And in 1928, of course, we get the first obituaries of Medardo Rosso, which of course he would have been extremely interested in and read, as Medardo Rosso was a kind of Montmartre figure. And when we say we don't have the day-to-day accounts of what he was up to in his studio, as far as we know from the obituaries, he was turned into a bit of an old embittered alco, so I don't think he was working every day in a very professional way. He just died in Milan, and we read here in that newspaper obituary of 1928 that he was an embittered man ever since Rodin stole his ideas for the Balzac in his Balzac in 1898. Now, of course, when he died, the son, Medardo Rosso, had to scamper to Paris to clear his father's atelier. This was obviously a huge task, and all the work was extremely heavy. And of course, the Salon d'automne organisers, I don't know to what extent they were thinking back to the exhibition of 1904, but they hastily arranged one of these great tributes, using presumably all the work that had been in the studio in Montmartre and bringing it to the Salon d'Automne in 1928 for a marvellous tribute. Now let me see how my slides are going just at this. I keep saying slides, that proves how long I've been here, doesn't it? Sorry about this. It's because it's the most congenial place, I hasten to add. So I wanted to show this picture of there are many works you won't see in here, which it doesn't tell you, of course, including the plasters, which are all in the Insel Hombroich in Dusseldorf. So whereas we know Yves Degas, even at plaster moment, tried to express distortion and uncomfortableness and even ugliness in his models and in their proletarian faces in terms of the proletarian ballet dancers, you get distortion and twisting, although there are other bits to it which I won't bother to go into, Asiatic bits, in Fautrier's more full-length sculptures. But this is the vital thing. And don't ask me why someone has put 1994 there. This is actually on the Medardo Rosso Museum site, and this is obviously, I would imagine, you're the expert, but it's obviously a photo of the installation of the Salon d'Automne in 1929, where Medardo Rosso finds himself in front of a Cézanne, and you can see the lines there where somebody else, presumably, or perhaps the artist, has wanted to crop out the photo of his own work. But that gives you an idea of what was in the exhibition, as does, of course, in 1928. I mean 1929, the Salon d'Automne exhibition, as does, of course, the catalogue, which was prefaced by Louis Vaucel, the great critic of Cubism and Fauvism, whose appreciations and personal souvenirs of Rosso at the time indeed discussed the concept of impressionist sculpture. So maybe that's where I don't know if that's in France where the first use of the term came from, despite the arguments around that. Here I've said the full panoply of Rosso's extraordinary wax sculptures were displayed. The early proletarian themes, ragamuffin, Jewish boy, a concierge portrait, so directly corresponding to Fautrier's own predilections. Now and then I think I showed this for some reason to give you an idea of also all the stuff that poor Francesco had to move out of the studio, if that was indeed still there. I don't know about the state of it. And I wanted to show this bookmaker, because this is in theory the work that Rosso thinks of as the precursor to the great Balzac by Rodin. That's a long story which we won't go into, but the interesting thing is when Fautrier first came to London as this little boy, the first work we have from him, but I wasn't able to show it here, is called A Portrait of a Jewish Boy, 1915, and he was friends with Epstein, and Epstein's circle, who kind of looked after this little infant prodigy in London. Secondly, he too was I don't know, I've got no idea if Epstein told him about the 1904 retrospective or anything, but he too was very interested in themes of poverty and the poor. Oh, sorry, I'll go past that. And proletarian. So this is, of course, the ragamuffin, and the old, and the old and the ugly. And this is Fautrier's very early painting of his own concierge. You see how at this stage when he's changing his painterly style at this moment. We are again going to have time to go through that. This work is in Tourcoing, it's in the show. This idea of poverty and ugliness and big hands and so forth is affecting his painting. So of course he would have been entranced to see the way that the form, as everyone has said, falls back into matter in a way perhaps more vivid because more contemporary in its subject matter, less idealized than Rodin. And also even the way, because when I first saw this, especially as I saw it small, I was looking at the top down. I couldn't see what it was supposed to be of. But of course I then see underneath the hat the features of again, Daumier, very Daumier-esque face. But there's a kind of gestalt perception thing, whereas if you don't see the features, you see it in a completely different way until you see the features, and then you read into the matter. So I believe personally that this exhibition was of absolutely extreme importance for Fautrier, who found in it a kind of shocking confirmation of his idea that sculpture could be different from either the academic or the post-Cubist or let alone surrealist or whatever, sculpture at the time. That was corroborated indeed by what was happening in painting in terms of late Monet. And of course, there was also the question of wax that he saw in the Salon d'Automne. And immediately, in this idea of moving in between painting and sculpture, he introduces encaustic into his own painterly surfaces. He's the only person doing this at the time, and makes these sort of heads things which are, again, very curious to read. There is a Pompeian craze going on at the time, but I think the wax and the faces of Medardo Rosso are more important. This is Mariette, again, where the features are kind of bleeding away into a surface which, although it is a vertical surface, it's actually made horizontally as a kind of caress. He was doing this with even with the autopsy, as you saw before, just at this period, and using wax in his painting. That's a kind of flip, if you like, between an early work of that period and the darkness, which here is hair, and what becomes sort of massacre and burning in a hostage painting later on. I don't know how I go on in this. There's also this question of a very great distortion in his pre-war sculptures, which I think is a kind of homage both to Rosso, if necessary, and also the idea of la foglia, which is one of Rosso's themes. He himself, Fautrier, frequented the Salpêtrière and used photographs of inmates of the, what was called at the time, lunatic asylum, to give an extra dimension of ugliness and also pathos to his work at this time, but also in terms of the masks, because there's almost his whole production, except the plasters, that are so important in this show. Of course, André Derain was also making masks at this time, but nonetheless, Derain was playing with more kind of Mycenaean and ancient Greek things and not really being so interested in surface. So back we get to the Etche Pure, and what is very beautiful is to see the plaster of the Grand Tête Tragique and see the coloration on the plaster, which is so close to the otage. This is such a little known work. I can't even find where it is at the moment. These plasters are so extraordinarily rare. It's not in the show. And I don't believe it's in the Insel Hombroich. So I don't know how I found it, but it shows you what these were really like. You remember the actual origins of portraiture are to do with death masks and the coloration of things which may indeed have been wax. There's an idea of cosmetics and the idea of portraiture coming out of death, like Coptic coffins and things in early Fautrier. So that I'm getting very worked up and forgetting my rhetorical conclusion. I wanted to point out that the great sculptured hostage, I'm just finishing again with another image I didn't know, but this is the only one. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I wanted to emphasize this is the only cast which says plomb, lead, and the first post-plaster hostage, which I encountered for the first time when I was doing my MA research in the basement of the Château de Sceaux, next to the actual post which was used to execute hostages in the Vallée aux Loups that they brought there. That big aesthetic shock for me, which I'm so rarely able to share with people, it was in lead, which is a very intractable, scratchable, and completely different and less precious material than bronze. So the fact is that it was interesting that Philida brought up the business of Germaine Richier. Germaine Richier, if we read her biography, comes back to Paris after the war. I don't know if she was soon enough back in Paris for 1945, but by 1949, Francis Pange is writing his very, very famous text on Fautrier, and she would certainly have been aware of his existence as a post-war sculpture of note, whether or not she visited him. Her show, which nobody knows about in London in 1949, a complete retrospective at the Anglo-French Art Centre, really kick-started our geometry of fear sculpture, which is also something people don't really know. But I just wanted to show how important after Fautrier, who by the Italians was supremely acknowledged as the originator of the informel. This is by Burri, for example, a little-known sculptor. He was, of course, he won the Venice Biennale. He got the Grand Prix in 1960. Enrico Crispolti and other people, and Giancarlo Argon wrote extensively about him. And he was really most important person for post-war Italian art. So I think that, and this even shows something more intractable with a hostage in the background, just to say, I'm sure Fautrier himself would have said, thank you, Medardo Rosso, and the post-war sculptors of the 1950s and 60s in this style, which has had such a heritage. We won't go through hundreds and hundreds of more examples, also should say, thank you, Medardo Rosso. And thank you for allowing me to share my secret life with you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I want to introduce Christian Berger, who is a research fellow and lecturer at the Johannes Gutenberg Universität Mainz, and currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. He received his MA and PhD in art history from the Freie Universität Berlin, and was a fellow at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, at the Centre Allemand d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris, a research fellow and lecturer at the Philippe Universität Marburg. His scholarly interests focus on modern and contemporary art, with specialization in conceptualism of the 1960s and 1970s and 19th century French art. He has published a book on repetition and experiment as artistic strategies in the work of Edgar Degas, articles in journals, and conference papers and exhibition catalogues. His postdoctoral research project, Worldly Matter, the Materials of Conceptual Art, aims to re-evaluate established narratives of conceptual art in North America and Western Europe with an expanded international context. Yes, Christian is going to be talking on Medardo Rosso, Giovanni Anselmo, and the dialectics of matter and dematerialization.
Okay, so thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. And now I'm just looking for my slides and make sure that Thorn has put them. Sorry. Okay, so again, I'm very happy to take part in this event for many different reasons. I mean, and one is also that I was quite happy to develop a few thoughts on Medardo Rosso, also because it brings me back to when I was writing my PhD on repetition and Degas, and I became interested in Medardo Rosso at that time. And actually, one catalog and one text that particularly awakened my interest was the catalog Medardo Rosso, Second Impressions, with Sharon's terrific essay on repetition and Medardo Rosso in it. And I mean, you will hear also for this talk now that what I'm presenting is quite indebted to Sharon's research. Although today I will look at Rosso through the lens of Italian arte povera artist Giovanni Anselmo, and hence from a perspective that has much more to do with my current research here at the Courtauld. So Medardo Rosso is nowadays widely recognized as one of the main figures in the history of modern sculpture. As Sharon and others have shown, the Italian artist's transformation of certain conventions of the medium was based on a reconfigured use of materials traditionally associated with sculpture, such as clay, wax, plaster, or bronze, in combination with new materials such as silicone molds, as well as innovative modes of presentation. while Rosso's importance was called into question by art historians such as Rosalind Krauss, for whom Rosso did not count as a true modernist, many artists during the last century, ranging from Umberto Boccioni to Alberto Giacometti to Henry Moore, as you have heard several times today, have expressed their admiration for Rosso's work. Its ongoing fascination for artists today is also demonstrated by Tony Craig's participation in the current exhibition, and while Craig, in Julia Peyton-Jones' interview for the catalogue and also in an earlier text, stresses the importance of materiality or thinking with material in Rosso's work, which will also be my primary perspective on his practice, Boccioni, Giacometti and Moore were fascinated by Rosso's attempts to forget the material of sculpture or to dematerialize it. A short text by Giovanni Anselmo, published in an exhibition catalogue from 1996, seems to argue in the same direction as these earlier accounts. And I will read the quote to you in full. Once, while looking at a group of works by Medardo Rosso, some of them in wax, I had a unique sensation. The sculptures, while I walked around them, seemed to move. The matter they were made of, because of the way in which it was given expression, vibrated not only on the surface, but inside. It is as if it had a beating heart. The image that still remains in my eyes is that of a burning flame. The impression I had was like a form and transformation of matter being dematerialized, a sculpture that denies and cancels itself. I will come back to this really quite fascinating text at various points in my talk, but for now allow me only to focus on the part of matter being dematerialized. In the 1960s and 1970s, when Anselmo's artistic practice took shape and he became one of the pivotal figures in the Arte Povera movement, dematerialization was a key term in art critical debate. Introduced by critics Lucy R. Lepard and John Chandler in 1968 in an article titled The Dematerialization of Art, and then restated in Lepard's highly influential later anthology, 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972, the term was criticized almost immediately after its conception, most prominently perhaps by Terry Atkinson of British conceptual art collective Art and Language, and by American artist Mel Bochner. The famously long subtitle of Lepard's anthology, which lists tendencies such as minimal, antiform, earth, or process art, points to the fact that Lepard's aim, as Petra Lange-Berndt has stressed in her volume on materiality, was, and I quote, not to dispense with materials, but instead to redefine and update the category. Nonetheless, the very term dematerialization still continues to inform a misleading view of, at least North American and Western European, conceptualism as a primarily intellectual, idea and thought-based enterprise for which physical aspects or concerns of materiality were at best secondary. However, even some of the artists that formed the core of North American conceptual art in the late 1960s were indeed very interested in materiality. And the best example might be Robert Barry, who was part of a group promoted by pioneering exhibition organizer, dealer and publisher Esther Siegelorb in New York in the late 1960s. While Barry's work is commonly discussed under the heading of dematerialization, for example in Alex Alvaro's highly influential book on the subject, Barry himself insisted on the physical aspect of his art and was very much concerned with issues of materiality. The artist's particular interest at the end of the 1960s lay in energetic phenomena such as radioactivity and electromagnetic waves, all of which he referred to as materials in his interviews and statements, where he repeatedly stated his fascination with them and their particular potentials. For example, Barry released small doses of radioactivity and generated radio waves in his studio or in gallery spaces. What you see here is one of 2 page spreads showing Barry's contribution to Germano Celan's seminal collection Arte Povera, published in 1969. Neither the waves and the transmitters that produced them, nor the radioactive material or the radiation are visible on these photographs, and you might indeed also wonder whether these are indeed two different images. As James Nisbet has shown in his book, Ecologies, Environments and Energy Systems, this preoccupation with forms of energy was an important strain in the art of the 1960s and 1970s, and was also essential for Giovanni Anselmo. In his statement for Celan's Arte Povera volume, Anselmo wrote, and I'm only quoting 3 key sentences here: I, the world, things, life, we are situations of energy. My work really is the physication of the force of an action, of the energy of the situation or an event. Referring to his own work, he continues, it is necessary, for example, that the energy of a torsion lives with its true force. It certainly wouldn't live just by its form. Anselmo made 2 works called Torsion or Torsione in 1968, one of which is today in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. For this work, several cowhides have been cast in the surface of a cement block. Their far ends are wound round a long wooden T-handle, which is turned back as far as it will go. Only the wall prevents the handle from swinging back. And these photographs depict Anselmo installing the piece for a show at Sonnabend Galerie in Paris in 1969, and I think they communicate at least an idea of the energy that is invested, accumulated, and contained in this work, and of the imminent threat of the handle breaking loose and moving through the room. My main point of interest here, and this is what finally brings us back to Medardo Rosso, is the idea of an object that contains and still preserves the energy that has been invested in it, in a way that would allow for this energetic potential to suddenly emerge under certain conditions. And for me, this resonates closely with Anselmo's reading of Rosso, especially of the matter that vibrated, of the form and transformation, and finally the burning flame. My suggestion is that Anselmo's short text highlights a specifically energist, if you can say so, reading of these sculptures. At first glance, as I said in the beginning, Anselmo's description resembles those earlier accounts that had to do with potential in Rosso's sculpture to capture fleeting moments and transitory states, and thus to evoke a potential for transformation through the way in which forms and surfaces are characterized. And of course, there is also an aspect of energy in this, quite beautifully expressed in fact by Tony Craig in the interview for this catalog. I hope you will all have a chance to read it. I think it's also on the webpage. But if we were to use the term dematerialization for these phenomena, it would be a very different understanding to how the term is normally used, and I would actually say misused, for conceptualism or conceptual art. But Anselmo's text also alludes to other aspects of energy. Referring explicitly to Rosso's wax sculpture, he writes, "The image that still remains in my eyes is that of a burning flame." Therefore, I would now briefly like to consider the significance of wax in Rosso's work and as a material for sculpture in general. Wax is a material at once amorphous, formless, and polymorphous. This means it can take on any shape and also a wide range of consistencies, from brittle to supple to liquid, with gradual transitions between them. In contrast to other sculptural materials such as clay, plaster, or bronze, wax easily returns to this formable state. Georges Didy-Uvermont, drawing on a passage from Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre, therefore describes wax as a fixed instability and a substance between two states. Because of its texture, its capacity to take on any form as well as different colors, and its history as a material for anatomical model making and death masks, wax is traditionally associated with the human body. This is also why wax sculpture seemed unacceptable as high art since the 18th century. Julius von Schlosser, in his History of Portraiture in Wax, referred to this decline in status as, and I quote, a downward progress from the topmost levels of society to the lowest, and even as a proletarization. And it's worth noting that two of Rosso's other main materials, with the exception of bronze, hence plaster and clay, were also regarded as low materials in the 19th century. According to Dietmar Rübel in his book Plasticity, an Art History of the Mutable, Rosso elevated the precariousness of wax and its tendency towards formlessness into the status of an aesthetic principle, a move that should prove consequential for art of the following decades. Through his unique method of work, Rosso achieved a surface quality, and I quote, as if the wax was still warm, starting to melt and moving downwards. Already in 1905, Hungarian-Austrian critic Ludwig Hevesi described this aesthetic achievement in a remarkable paragraph drawing a connection between wax and bronze casts. And this is my one translation. There is a floating element in it, the animated quiet of undefined states. Also his bronze appears like wax in that respect. You get the impression as if at varying temperatures its aggregate state, and hence its form, was supposed to change. And to me, this short paragraph quite impressively captures the transformative potential of Rosso's sculpture, which Anselmo referred to as the impression of a form in transformation. Hevesi's description of the animated quiet and the floating element resonates to a certain degree with Anselmo's powerful metaphors of the beating heart and the sculpture that denies and cancels itself. But it does so in a way that deliberately highlights the importance of materiality. By referring to undefined states and different aggregate states of matter, the critic describes the energetic potential of Rosso's work in terms closely related to materiality. And there would also, of course, be more to be said about the floating aspect on liquidity, which we discussed, or which we heard about in the preceding panel. And such a reading of Rosso based on energy, liquidity, and transformation, and this is my short conclusion, captures many different dimensions of Rosso's work, and also the potential that later generations saw in it. The question remains, however, how this relates to dematerialization. And if at all, I would say, it would be through the, at least imaginary, dissolution of the limits between different materials or different states of matter, which is, in the end, a very material endeavor. Thank you very much. It makes sense because she was a bibliographer as well. So that's fine. No, that's good. I didn't know.
That's amazing. Was that for pocket money?
So I think we go on to the panel.
Thank you very much, Christian. So we're now going to put the panel together, and we're going to be joined by Anthony Gormley. So just to say a word about Anthony Gormley, I don't think he needs a great deal of introduction, but I will say some words. And it is so Anthony Gormley is widely acclaimed for his sculptures, installations, and public artworks that investigate the relationship of the human body to space. His work has developed the potential opened up by sculpture since the 1960s through a critical engagement with both his own body and those of others in a way that confronts fundamental questions of where human beings stand in relation to nature and the cosmos. Gormley continually tries to identify the space of art as a place of becoming in which new behaviors, thoughts and feelings can arise. Gormley's work's been widely exhibited throughout the UK and internationally, with exhibitions at the Centro Cultural Banco do Brasil, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro and Brasileia, in Hamburg at the State Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, at the Hayward Gallery, London, at Malmö Courtauld in Sweden, at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, at the Humboldt in Denmark, and he has participated in major group shows such as the Venice Biennale in 1982 and 1986, and Documenta 8 Castle in 1987. Permanent public works include The Angel of the North, Gateshead, England, and Another Place, Crosby Beach, England, and Inside Australia, Lake Ballard, Western Australia, and Exposure at Leidstad, the Netherlands. Gormley was awarded the Per Turner Prize in 1994, the South Bank Prize for Visual Arts in 1999, the Bernard Heiliger Award for Sculpture in 2007, the Obayashi Prize in 2012, and the Premium Imperiale in 2013. In 1997, he was made an officer of the British Empire and has been awarded a knighthood for services to the arts in 2013. He is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, an honorary doctor of the University of Cambridge, and a fellow of Trinity and Jesus College, Cambridge. Gormley has been a Royal Academician since 2003 and a British Museum trustee since 2007. So, if you'd like to...
Sorry, can we open the window, because it's a bit stuffy in here, and after all but anyway, lovely to be here, and thank you very much, Christian, for your well, everybody. I mean, what an incredible, come and join us. What a wonderful, shall I move up one? What a wonderful group of people to talk about an extraordinary artist that, in a way, remains both influential and enigmatic in equal degrees today. I'm just wondering, can I was dying to take part when Philida was talking, because I think this issue about time is central and critical to your contribution, Christian, when we talk about transformation and dematerialization. The question for me is, where does this transformation happen? And I think that the shift that we've seen in as it were, the arena of arts practice has shifted, I think, from object relations to subject relations. In other words, what that transformation happening within the mind, the heart, the feeling potential of the viewer. But I think in continuing the question that I think Philida so beautifully raised about what tense does Rosso's work act in? I think it is, she's correct, it acts in the present, but I just want to, I want to investigate that a bit. I think it is about becoming, and this knife edge that he travels between, you could say, exposure and insulation, allows the space to, and this is so contrary to the idea of visual art, which is to make apparent that which is not visible. The technique that he uses is in a sense, to use this fluid surface of wax to distance ourselves from that presentness, that representation, in a way, traditionally within the history. You know, if you take Gombrich's model, you know, the challenge of the kind of the onward challenge of the history of Western art is to make the perfect copy, to recover visuality. Well, the thing that makes Rosso so important, I think, is that he stands at this cusp where he wants to engage us in a moment of becoming where we, as it were, the observers, become participants in the arising of something. And what is that something? That something is emotion. The thing that monumentality and, in a way, the object nature of sculpture has distanced us from. And in a way, that distance that minimalism and conceptualism compounded. And that, for me, is why Rosso is so critically important. So I was amazed by his words. The distortions that others the distortions that others correct, these are not flaws. They were given by our or my emotions, which are true, without the material perspective that you've been taught by false, limited education since childhood. The only true perspective is your emotion. That notion that in the fall of the ideological, in the fall of, in a sense, in the shadow of the pain of war and the hostage, that actually truth has to be found in a new location, and that art can be, in some senses, both in its making and a reception, a threshold for a truth that is not objective, is not ideological, but is made by a kind of compact. It's not surprising that one of the most enigmatic of Rosso's works is called Conversation. What is a conversation? A conversation is the remaking of a personal experience that is offered in speech to another living person, with a view that there, in the telling, your experience is enlarged, but so in the receiving is the hearer's. We've talked about the space, the negative space, in that extraordinarily abstract, you could say, work that has no features. The denial of features that is so consistent in Rosso, and there's no question that Ecce Pur or Bambino Ebreo is the progenitor of the Sleeping Muse of Brancusi's. But the denial of feature allows this space where the projection of the viewer is given what is it? It's an opportunity to arise and be given focus. The radicality of that as the offering of art is in my view total, because it separates the history of in a sense the service that art does to the world from the power of the patron, and indeed from all forms of illustration, and liberates it into some other place of emergence, in which this critical balance between dematerialization and proposition, material proposition, which is actually what sculpture is. It's in the same form as a syllogism in philosophy. It's a proposition. Can we look at the world like this? Anyway, I'm very, very taken by the emergence of the plinth in this exhibition, and indeed by the first photograph that you showed, Sharon, in which the artist disappears behind plinths. The work of Rosso is made between the space of the stomach and, or the heart and the eye. His entire oeuvre can be embraced, and yet, rather like Giacometti, but in a totally different way, he is interested in space and distance. I don't think I think there's a huge subject to be discussed here, but I guess what I'm interested in is the forms of making that make Rosso's sculpture so radical, and it's close to the kitchen. I wanted to just mention that the thing that nobody else has talked about, but it links Rosso to Giacometti and to Bacon, is the fact that when we see so many of the records of his exhibitions, these products of the fluid, and you could say liquid processes, are framed in a glass box. He invented the vitrine before Duchamp and before Beuys, and before the vitrine that was this thing of, in a sense, removal of that which is too intimate into, in a way, a specimen case. I'm not sure, I have no precise reason for this, but it's connected to the emotion in the work. I leave that hanging because I think it's another huge subject in relation to Rosso. But I wanted to end really with the biggest question that maybe he engages us in, which is about how do we see what is an appearance? How does something become apparent? And the compact, neuroscience has many theories about the visual cortex and its relationship with, as it were, memory. The relationship between projection and reception in as it were, the engagement with the visual. And I think that Rosso is asking us that question. So when we see the remains of that extraordinary sculpture in the bus, who would make a sculpture of a row of people sitting? Of course, this is a compound thing, and he's taken maybe busts from other places and brought them together. But we are in the position of the future. They are traveling towards us. The minute you have the title, the radicality of that work becomes very apparent. So, in a way, this brings me back to where I started, the notion of time in his work, which is also true in that last thing, the impression of the street. Where are they going? They're going in the other direction. They're going away from us. Again, as in the conversation, it's the spaces between, and that extraordinary way the right-hand figure is absolutely flat. And it's lost its materiality in the same way that maybe somebody with whom we have connection, to whom we have said goodbye and is disappearing, becomes, in a way, a gap, a void in space at large. Sorry, I'm actually quite...
Could I say something that links up what you've just said, which is very emotional with your paper to do with the burning flames? Because when you said you agree that the moment is to do with the present and the present tense, I would say that there is also an invitation to think about it as the moment between death in life and life in death, and so that the invitation to us is the invitation of every still life in one way, but it's a very powerful invitation to think about our own mortality. We're not just saying, wow, it's the present in some of them, because you can't possibly perceive some of those things without perceiving their historicity and the transparency of the emotion that carries through time. But what I forgot to say, but it links up because I hadn't heard your paper when I just had a little postscript, is that Max Kozloff's article in Art International in 1963, I was leafing through Art International for some reason, maybe in pursuit of Max Kozloff, which I doubt. And much to my astonishment, it was my first encounter with La Riconoscenza, with this woman throwing herself into the grave. And in like two Art Internationals afterwards, there was Carl Andre's thing of making the slits in the floor of the gallery. And there seemed to be the most absolutely precise relationship between leaving beside convention, cutting a hole in the floor, and then this conceptual work of cutting a hole in the floor, which of course is pretending to be not very emotional. But when you see in Art International the Max Kozloff article, and then just the closeness, it seems as though there really is a cross-period communication, and it gives Andre another dimension, certainly. I mean, I loved your paper, Christian. It was so provocative. But I think that the movingness, which I also experienced with Rosso, is doing that thing of being the moment of the present meeting the moment across time, and our perception in the present reflecting on the fact that we're not going to be the people reflecting in the present in future presents, for starters. So I just wanted to really highlight that little Max Kozloff essay and its weird relationship to a different present. And also say actually that Giacometti was also speaking in dialect to his mother and in French and in his kind of best accent when the dealers came. I was very sympathetic to your remark about language. But I think in the School of Paris, everyone was flipping languages all the time. I don't think they were always having existential problems about it. But it was really good to bring that up, I think.
One quick comment about Kozloff. He has this beautiful line that's very similar to Anselmo. He says, when you see Madame X, Rosa's work, it's not a sculpture, it's not a woman, it's a tremulous state of being. And I thought that was one of Kozloff's most beautiful understanding of the relationship to these figures, that you really feel that if you open yourself to them.
And of course, when the Italian reception of Fautrier was very tied up with Bergson and Materie e Memorie. I mean, that's the title of Argan's book on Fautrier, which we spoke about in the Bergson conference that was held here. But of course, Bergson was really coterminous with that very turn of the century moment of Rosso. And of course, we forgot to think about that when we were having our Bergson conference. So that's a kind of funny double whammy, really.
Doesn't all this turn around the issue of, in a sense, the reflexive object? And I think that's the space that we are in now, in terms of the imaginative space that art offers us, is that it engages us in a form of self-questioning, proprioception, auto-observation, and I just do. I feel so profoundly that Rosso was, in a sense, the holder of the key of this transition, and I mean, everybody said it, that he manages to sidestep sentimentality and mawkishness by, in a way, asking really fundamental questions. What does it mean to look? What does it mean to see? What is an appearance? How do we engage with the world? What is a skin? And all of that thing about edge that you talked about, Phillida, that is so pertinent to the, if you like, the fabrication of the sculpture, and yet that he manages to make it into the subject.
I'm really interested in your very moving talk just now. Thank you for that. When does it happen? I wonder whether there isn't, for me, state with Medardo Rosso where the relationship I feel that he has with the thing as an act of displacement, that in a way the titles and everything about the work that locate it in a sort of intellectual, academic way disappear, and the physicality of what remains is all that matters. And I think that's an absolute major breakthrough in terms of sculpture. I mean, for me, Picasso's Glass of Absinthe is almost like the beginning of the 20th century. But I think Medardo Rosso is the one who lays out, spills out the territory for how to make. He revolutionizes how to make, in my opinion, enabling all sorts of things to happen that take over from subject. So in a way, the subject disappears, and we're left with just the object. And to me, that's a miraculous
I would put it another way, that the object remains, and the acceptance of the action of time on the object itself is intrinsic to its nature. In other words, it's the dust that falls on it, the accidents that happen to it, that is, in a way, reinforces its object nature. But the what is it? The algebra is that the subject then reverts to the viewer. And that this is the alchemy that I think is so extraordinary, and this is well, that's why I make sculpture rather than paintings. It's the fact, here is this thing. There is a thing in the world that it demands the world to accommodate it. It's like a piece of furniture, but it isn't a piece of furniture. And with the Rodin and this exhibition, that that relationship with furniture is so. I mean, I couldn't believe that photograph where Rosso is literally, he's disappeared behind the furniture. But at the same time, here it is offered to you at almost the same place that the sculptor made it. This position between the stomach and intellect. And then it's for you to make something of it. And there's no...
But I don't know how to put this other than very sort of bluntly, but I think the obsession with the subject gets in the way with the status of the thing as a thing.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the subject as the name of it or what it's about. I'm talking about the subject as, in a way, the emergence of truth and meaning, which is always fugitive and not fixed.
But maybe if we think of Italy, what's so interesting is that in terms of the personal response, is that the response in Italy to Fautrier / Rosso, because I know about Fautrier, but obviously if Anselmo is looking at Rosso, there are all sorts of Rosso events in Italy I'm not aware of. It was the moment of Sartrean existentialism going everywhere, of course. But the point is, because he was an atheist and a materialist in a bad Marxist way, the Italians would not embrace Sartrean existentialism. And this is why they displaced him with both Kierkegaard in the experimental magazine called Either or in particular Bergson. And Bergson is not to do with individual choice. It's to do with this kind of fluid, it goes back to this fluid depersonalization of matter and memory and time, la durée, and spirit, élan vital, without the, I'm going to make a choice now, and I don't believe in anything controlling me, which was the premise of the existentialist free will. So the Italian reception, which is much more congenial to Medardo Rosso, is using all these more depersonalized ways of thinking about response philosophically at that time and in the climates you discuss. I think it's quite, I haven't thought through this before, but I was very fascinated about it in other circumstances, but I think in terms of what you're saying and response and emotion, and yet the perils of narcissism, if you like, the perils of me, involved in talking about response. This is a way of kind of historicizing the fact that it wasn't just one flaming, burning, beating heart, but many beating hearts.
What do you have to say about the transformational in Rosso? I mean, that you didn't already. I thought your paper was marvelous, because Anselmo, I mean, of all of the arte povera, Anselmo was always the one who gave us the biggest challenge, I think. Those cabbages squashed up against the granite. The compass set into a granite block. The torsion thing. And yet, I always felt that he was trying to teach us a lesson about it, or maybe trying to absolve himself of sensibility and, in a way, the weight of tradition. I mean, the arte povera did for the whole of Europe what it had to do for itself, which was to separate itself from its own, in a way, beauty, and find another core for art.
I mean, I think, of course, that these analogies only reach up to a certain point. I mean, I also found it interesting that, like, so many parallels we are drawing, I feel like, from Fautrier to minimalism to arte povera and conceptualism. When I thought about the casting performances that Sharon mentioned, I thought almost of Richard Serra throwing the lead or something. And yet, of course, like, whatever of these analogies, when you think them through, then there's also a limit, and then it's still very, very different. And I mean, with Anselmo, I mean, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, like the analogy that I tried to make about this notion of energy, I think that is one important thing. But I mean, although I'm not totally specializing in Anselmo, but I mean, there's also this other notion in him. Like, for example, when he has this moment where he sees that he's standing on the mountain and there's no shadow, like his body is casting no shadow. And so I mean, there is an existential dimension also linked to his or our place in the world. And I mean, that would, I guess, be much closer to what you were saying, also the connections to existentialism that you were drawing. I mean, that would be one way that maybe there's something also in Anselmo which attracted him to Rosso, which has not to do with the stuff that I was talking about, but like about more existential dimension also in his project, perhaps. I mean, that would be one way to answer.
I mean, the sense of the human body is sort of like the human body is part of, is subject to gravity. Is, that there are these forces that are in a sense moving through us into which we're subjected, and we're just part of a natural process. I mean, the sort of famous salad thing, I think, is just like, there's a sort of process of, animal, mineral. There's a sort of like a geological time. So in some ways, I didn't actually know about. I should have known about it, but I didn't know about the Anselmo, love for Medardo Rosso. But actually, it came to me as a big surprise. I mean, I suppose in a very obvious sort of way, I thought of Marisa Merz, and I was thinking of the wax, or even, Mario in his work, where you have sit-in and the quality of the wax changing and so on. But in terms of the sort of, I think something about what Anthony was saying about the emotions, which is, I think maybe something that makes him, in a way, almost more actual again, in a way that for a while I think the emotions were in a sense bracketed out, and I think conceptualism actually in many ways was a sort of bracketing out of an emotional approach to art, and that, with Medardo Rosso you have a sort of, this sense of some sort of immediacy. There's a sort of relationship to this work which has a notion of human contact or something, rather than something which is more abstracted.
I mean, maybe when we talk about arte povera and Anselmo in this way, then we could also think about like how conceptualism in a more general sense is not an entirely cerebral affair. That, for example, Robert Barry was interested in telepathy. I mean, there are many like existential dimensions in many of these practices. Maybe that would explain such connections. I mean, what you just mentioned with Marisa Merz and maybe also Cornelis and the poor materials. I mean, that's an analogy that I thought about. But, I mean, you could also draw it, but then it also only goes to a certain point. But maybe we could talk at some point in discussion about wax and clay as elemental materials, as poor materials, as materials that have a lower hierarchy, because it's something that I think you're also very interested in.
But I think you said it all beautifully, that these were all regarded as transitional states for, before the final thing, which would be in Carrara marble or in bronze. And the very fact that he wants to, in a way, honor the vehicle of sensation, or of the captured moment, the remembered moment, the moment of being in which this thing that is also connected to this feeling arises. I think I think conversation is such an important word, because he's saying can I share with you? This is as far as I can get with this feeling that I have, and maybe you can come and complete it.
I don't want to labour the point. I'd be interested to know how we look at that work in particular without knowing what the title is. Because to me there's something so absolute about it as a thing in itself. I think what
Are we talking about etche pour, or are we talking about
conversation?
A conversation.
And its status as an object that just is what it is. I know it's a very bland thing to say. It seems to me so incredibly powerful. It was actually quite a shock to look at the title and then try to make the title work with my response to it as an object, and that seemed complicated. I think in another quantum leap, just thinking about Anselmo, that I mean, I love his work and always have, but there's something of the demonstration about it. Something is being demonstrated, and something is being held in that moment of demonstration, which at the absolute opposite end, Medardo Rosso for me doesn't engage in that way at all. We're actually quite abandoned as viewers with what is there, almost as though we're looking at the remains rather than, again, it goes back to my obsession with the syntax of a work.
I think someone back there wanted to.
Oh, yeah, thank you. You looked at Rosso through the lens of Anselmo's interest in energetics and transformation. And I wonder to what degree you think that Anselmo merely reiterates tropes of spiritual transcendence of base matter into privileged form through artistic agency. And I wonder if Rosso's emphasis of that polymorphous quality of the wax that is no longer covered up and actually flaunted isn't much rather a rematerialization than a dematerialization. Using the emphasis of the subversive qualities of material in general as a conduit of meaning, which, as we've then also seen, kind of has the propensity to even infect displays or traditions of form, conventions of display, or hierarchies of material.
I mean, to the second thing, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's exactly my point. I would say it's about maybe not but like materialization instead of dematerialization. And the first thing about whether there's tropes and yep, I mean, probably maybe to a certain degree I might agree with this. I mean, also because I mean there. Yeah, I mean, this idea of like a sculpture having a potential to come to life. Yeah, I mean, these are of course thoughts that have a tradition, and hence they are topoi to a certain degree. Which, I mean, I wouldn't say that it the values what Anselm was expressing there. I also don't think that this was your point, but that is to a certain degree topoi or tropes, yeah. Why not? Yeah.
But I think that the success of Rosso is that Madame Blavatsky isn't in the equation. Isn't it? I mean...
But you brought her in, and that makes me think of spirit photography, where you can see funny similarities, but this is all evil thoughts.
Oh dear.
Wrong move.
Actually, I've got to go.
Well, I think that puts an end to proceed.
No, you can talk about Madame Blavatsky, and
I think we're moving on actually at this point. Anyway.
Thank you very much, everybody.